31. Working in groups, PT2. After maths, Harry paced backward and forward in his general's office, which made a wonderful room for pacing. It didn't have any other uses as far as he could tell. How? How? Hermione shouldn't have won that battle. Not on her first try, not when she wasn't at all violent by her nature. Automatically being a great military commander on top of everything else was too much even for her. Had she read about the tactic in a military history book? But it hadn't been just that one tactic. She'd had her forces perfectly positioned to block any retreat. Her troops had been better coordinated than his or Draco's. Had Professor Quirrell broken his promise not to help her? Had he given her the diary of General Tacticus or something? Harry was missing something here, something really important, and his mind went around and around in circles, and he still couldn't figure it out. Finally, Harry sighed. He wasn't getting anywhere on this, and he had to go learn the breaking drill hex from Hermione or someone. Before the next battle, Professor Quirrell had explained to Harry, his voice amused, but with a sharp undertone of warning, that no magical items, except the ones I give you, included Muggle technology, no matter how much, that wasn't magic. Plus, Harry also needed to figure out how to bring down Mr. Goyle next time. Battles counted for a lot of Quirrell points if you were a general, and Harry needed to get cracking if he wanted to win Professor Quirrell's Christmas wish. In his private room at Slytherin, Draco Malfoy stared off into space, as though the wall in front of his desk was the most fascinating surface in the world. How? How? In retrospect, it had been an obvious sort of idea as cunning plots went, but Granger wasn't supposed to be cunning. She'd been too much of a Hufflepuff to use a simple strike hex. Had Professor Quirrell been advising her despite his promise? And then Draco, finally, did what he should have done much earlier. What he should have done after the first time he met with Granger. What Harry Potter had told him to do, trained him to do, and yet Harry had also warned Draco that it would take time to make his brain realize that the methods applied to real life, and Draco hadn't understood that until today. He could have avoided every single one of his mistakes if he'd just applied the things Harry had already told him. Draco said out loud, "I notice that I am confused. Your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused by fiction than by reality." Draco was confused. Therefore, something he believed was fiction. Granger should not have been able to do all that. Therefore, she probably hadn't. I promise not to help General Granger in any way that the two of you don't know about. Sudden, horrified realization, Draco swept papers out of the way, hunting through the mess on his desk, until he found it. And there it was, right in the list of people and equipment assigned to each of the three armies. Curse Professor Quirrell. Draco had read it, and he still hadn't seen it. The afternoon sunlight poured down into the office of the Sunshine Regiment, illuminating General Granger in her chair as though she glowed with a golden aura. "How long do you think it will take Malfoy to figure it out?" said General Granger. "Not long," said Colonel Blaise Zabini. "He may have already. How long will it take Potter to figure it out?" "Forever," said General Granger, "unless Malfoy tells him, or one of his own soldiers realizes. Harry Potter just doesn't think like that." "Really?" said Captain Ernie Macmillan, looking up from one of the corner tables where he was being crushed at chess by Captain Ron Weasley. They brought back all the other chairs after Malfoy had left, of course. "I mean, it seems kind of obvious to me, who would try to come up with all the ideas just by themselves." "Harry," said Hermione, at exactly the same time Zabini said, "Malfoy. Malfoy thinks he's way better than everyone else," said Zabini. "And Harry doesn't really see most other people like that," said Hermione. It was kind of sad, actually. Harry had grown up very, very alone. It wasn't that he went around thinking in words that only geniuses had a right to exist. Just wouldn't occur to him that anyone in Hermione's army besides Hermione could have any good ideas. "Anyhow," Hermione said, "Captains Goldstein and Weasley, you're on duty for thinking up strategic ideas for our next battle. Captains Macmillan and Susan, Macmillan and Bones, try to come up with some tactics we can use. Also, any training you think we should try. Oh, and congratulations on your marching song, Captain Goldstein. I think it was a big plus for esprit de corps." "What are you doing?" said Susan. "And Colonel Zabini." Hermione stood up out of her chair, stretching. "I'll try to figure out what Harry Potter is thinking, and Colonel Zabini will try to figure out what Draco Malfoy might do, and both of us will join you again after we come up with something. I'm going to walk while I think." Zabini, you want to come along? Yes, General, said Zabini stiffly. It hadn't been meant as an order. Hermione sighed to herself a little. This was going to take some getting used to. And although Zabini's first idea had certainly worked, she wasn't quite sure that Professor Quirrell's quote mixture of positive and negative incentives unquote would be enough to keep the Slytherin fully on her side until December, when traitors would be allowed for the first time. She still had no idea what she was going to do with Professor Quirrell's Christmas wish, either. Maybe she'd just ask Mandy if she wanted anything when the time came around. 32. Interlude. Personal financial management. But Headmaster, Harry argued, some of his desperation leaking into his voice, leaving all of my assets in one undiversified vault full of gold coins. It's crazy, Headmaster. It's like, I don't know, doing transfiguration experiments without consulting a recognized authority. You just don't do that with money. From the lined face of the old wizard, underneath, a festive holiday hat like a catastrophic automobile collision between cars of green and red cloth, a grave, sad look peered out at Harry. I'm sorry, Harry, said Dumbledore, and I do apologize, but allowing you control over your own finances would give you far too much independence of action. Harry's mouth opened, and no sound came out. He was, literally, speechless. I will permit you to withdraw 5 galleons for Christmas presents, said Dumbledore, which is more than any boy your age should spend, but poses no threat, I think. I can't believe you just said that. The words burst out of Harry's mouth. You admit to being that manipulative? Manipulative, said the old wizard, smiling slightly. No, manipulative would be if I did not admit it, or if I had some deeper motive behind the obvious. This is quite straightforward, Harry. You are not yet ready to play the game, and it would be foolish to allow you thousands of galleons with which to upset the game board. The bright hustle and bustle of Diagon Alley had increased by 100-fold and redoubled as Christmas approached, with all the shops enshrouded in brilliant sorceries that flashed and sparkled as though the season's spirit was about to blaze out of control and turn the whole area into a cheerful holiday crater. The streets were so crowded with witches and wizards in festive and loud clothing that your eyes were assaulted almost as severely as your ears, and it was clear, from the bewildering variety of the shoppers, that Diagon Alley was considered an international attraction. There were witches wrapped in giant swathes of cloth like toweled mummies, and wizards in formal top hats and bathrobes, and young children barely past toddling age who were decorated with lights that blazed almost as bright as the shops themselves, as their parents took them hand in hand through that magic wonderland and let them shriek to their heart's content. It was the season to be merry. And in the midst of all that light and cheer, a note of blackest night, a cold, dark atmosphere that cleared a few precious paces of distance, even in the midst of all that crush. No, said Professor Quirrell, with a look of grim revulsion, like he'd just bitten into food that not only tasted horrible, but was morally repugnant to boot. It was the sort of grim face an ordinary person might make after biting into a meat pie and discovering that it was rotten and had been made from kittens. Oh, come on, Harry said. You must have some ideas. Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said, his lips set in a thin line, I agreed to act as your adult guardian on this expedition. I did not agree to advise you on your choice of presents. I don't do Christmas, Mr. Potter. How about Newtonmas? Harry said brightly. Isaac Newton actually was born on December 25th, unlike some other historical figures I could name. This failed to impress Professor Quirrell. Look, said Harry, I'm sorry, but I've got to do something special for Fred and George, and I've got no idea of my options. Professor Quirrell made a thoughtful humming sound. You could ask which family members they most dislike, and then hire an assassin. I know someone from a certain government in exile who is quite competent, and he would give you a discount on multiple Weasleys. This Christmas, Harry said, dropping his voice into a lower register, give your friends the gift of death. That made Professor Quirrell smile. It went all the way to his eyes. Well, said Harry, at least you didn't suggest getting them a pet rat. Harry's mouth snapped shut, and he was regretting the words almost as soon as they were out of his mouth. Pardon me, said Professor Quirrell. Nothing, Harry said at once. Long, dumb story. And telling it seemed wrong somehow, maybe because Harry was afraid Professor Quirrell would have laughed even if Bill Weasley hadn't been cured and everything put back to right. And where had Professor Quirrell been that he'd never heard the story? Harry had gotten the impression that everyone in magical Britain knew. "Look," said Harry, "I'm trying to solidify their loyalty to me, you know. Make the Weasley twins my minions. Like the old saying goes, a friend isn't someone you use once and then throw away. A friend is someone you use over and over again. Fred and George are two of the most useful friends I have in Hogwarts, Professor Quirrell, and I plan to use them over and over again. So if you'd help me be Slytherin here and suggest something they might be very grateful for." Harry's voice trailed off invitingly. You just had to pitch these things the right way. They walked on for a good way before Professor Quirrell spoke again, his voice practically dripping with distaste. "The Weasley twins are using second-hand wands, Mr. Potter. They would be reminded of your generosity with every charm they cast." Harry clapped his hands together in involuntary excitement. "Just put the money on account at Ollivander's and tell Mr. Ollivander to never refund it. No, better yet, to send it to Lucius Malfoy if the Weasley twins didn't show up before the start of their next school year." "That's brilliant, Professor." Professor Quirrell did not look like he appreciated the compliment. "I suppose I can tolerate Christmas in that spirit, Mr. Potter, though only barely." Then he smiled slightly. "Of course that will cost you 14 galleons, and you only have 5. 5 galleons, Harry said, with a sniff of outrage. Just who does the headmaster think he's dealing with anyway? "I think," said Professor Quirrell, "that it simply did not occur to him to fear the consequences if you turned your ingenuity to the task of obtaining funds. Though you were wise to lose, rather than making it an explicit threat. Out of curiosity, Mr. Potter, what would you have done if I hadn't turned away in boredom while you, in a fit of childish pique, counted out 5 galleons worth of nuts?" "Well, the easiest way would have been to borrow money from Draco Malfoy," said Harry. Professor Quirrell chuckled briefly. "Seriously, Mr. Potter. Duly noted. Probably I'd have done a few celebrity appearances. I wouldn't resort to anything economically disruptive just for spending money." Harry had checked, and he would be allowed to keep the time turner while he went home for the holidays so that his sleep cycle didn't start to rotate. But then it was also possible that someone kept an eye out for magical day traders. The gold and silver trick would have taken work on the Muggle end and seed funding, and the goblins might have gotten suspicious after the first cycle. And starting a real bank would be a lot of work. Harry hadn't quite worked out any money-making methods that were fast and certain and safe, so he'd been very glad when Professor Quirrell had turned out to be so easily fooled. "I do hope those 5 galleons will be enough to last, since you counted them so carefully," said Professor Quirrell. "I doubt the headmaster shall be so eager to entrust me with your vault key a second time once he discovers I've been tricked." "I'm sure you did your best," Harry said with deep gratitude. "Do you need any assistance finding a safe place to store all those nuts, Mr. Potter?" "Well, sort of," said Harry. "Do you know of any good investment opportunities, Professor Quirrell?" And the two of them walked on, in their tiny sphere of silence and isolation, through the brilliant and bustling crowds. And if you looked carefully, you would see that where they went, leafy boughs faded, and flowers withered, and children's toys that played cheerful bells changed to lower and more ominous notes. Harry did notice, but he didn't say anything, just smiled a little to himself. Everyone had their own way of celebrating the holidays, and the Grinch was as much a part of Christmas as Santa. 33. Coordination Problems, PT1. I just recite to myself, over and over, until I can choose sleep. It all adds up to J.K. Rowling. The version of decision theory used in this chapter is not the academically dominant one. It's based on something called timeless decision theory that's under development by, among others, Gary Drescher, Wei Dai, Vladimir Nesov, and well, coughs a few times me. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. "Albus," Minerva said, not even trying to keep the worry out of her voice, as the two of them entered the Great Hall. "Something has to be done." The atmosphere at Hogwarts before Yuletide was usually bright and cheerful. The Great Hall had already been decorated in green and red, after a Slytherin and a Gryffindor whose Yule wedding had become a symbol of friendship transcending houses and allegiances, a tradition almost as ancient as Hogwarts itself, and which had even spread to Muggle countries. Now the students eating dinner were glancing nervously over their shoulders or sending vicious glares at other tables, or at some tables arguing heatedly. You could have described the atmosphere as tense, perhaps, but the phrase coming to Minerva's mind was fifth degree of caution. Take a school into 4 houses divided. Now into each year, add 3 armies at war, and the partisanship of dragon and sunshine and chaos had spread beyond the first years. They had become the armies for those who had no armies. Students were wearing armbands with insignia of fire or smile or upraised hand, and hexing each other in the corridors. All 3 first-year generals had told them to stop. Even Draco Malfoy had heard her out, and then nodded grimly, but their supposed followers hadn't listened. Dumbledore gazed out at the tables with a distant look. In every city, the old wizard quoted softly, the population has been divided for a long time, passed into the blue and the green factions, and they fight against their opponents, knowing not for what end they imperil themselves. So there grows up in them against their fellow men a hostility which has no cause, and at no time does it cease or disappear, for it gives place neither to the ties of marriage, nor of relationship, nor of friendship. And the case is the same even though those who differ with respect to these colors be brothers, or any other kin. I, for my part, am unable to call this anything except a disease of the soul. I'm sorry, said Minerva. I don't, Procopius, said Dumbledore. They took their chariot racing very seriously in the Roman Empire. Yes, Minerva, I agree that something must be done. Soon, Minerva said, her voice lowering even further. Albus, I think it must be done before Saturday. On Sunday, most students would leave Hogwarts to stay the holiday with their families. Saturday, then, was the final battle of the 3 first-year armies that would determine the awarding of Professor Quirrell's thrice-cursed Christmas wish. Dumbledore glanced over at her, studying her gravely. You fear that the explosion will come then, and someone will be hurt. Minerva nodded. And that Professor Quirrell will be blamed. Minerva nodded again, her face tight. She had long since become wise in the ways that defense professors were fired. Albus, Minerva said, we cannot lose Professor Quirrell now. We cannot. If he but stays through January, our 5th years will pass their owls. If he stays through March, our 7th years will pass their newts. He is remedying years of neglect in months. A whole generation will grow up able to defend themselves in spite of the Dark Lord's curse. You must stop the battle, Albus. Ban the armies now. I am not sure the defense professor would take that kindly, said Dumbledore, glancing over toward the head table where Quirrell was drooling into his soup. He did seem most attached to his armies, though when I agreed I thought there would be 4 in each year. The old wizard sighed. A clever man, probably with the best of intentions, but perhaps not clever enough, I fear. And to ban the armies might also trigger the explosion. But then, Albus, what will you do? The old wizard favored her with a benign smile. Why, I shall plot, of course. It's the new fashion in Hogwarts. And they had come too close to the head table for Minerva to say anything more. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. The first battle in December had been messy, or so Draco had heard. The second battle had been deranged, and the next one would be worse, unless the 3 of them together succeeded in their last desperate attempt to stop it. Professor Quirrell, this is insanity, Draco said flatly. This isn't Slytherin anymore, it's just. Draco was at a loss for words. He waved his hands helplessly. You can't possibly do any real plots with all this stuff going on. Last battle, one of my soldiers faked his own suicide. We have Hufflepuffs trying to plot, and they think they can, but they can't. Things just happen at random now. It doesn't have anything to do with who's cleverest, or which army fights best. He couldn't even describe it. I agree with Mr. Malfoy, said Granger, in the tones of someone who hadn't ever expected to hear herself saying those words. Allowing traitors isn't working, Professor Quirrell. Draco had tried forbidding anyone in his army to plot except him, and that had just driven the plots underground. No one wanted to be left out when the soldiers in other armies got to plot. After miserably losing their last battle, he'd finally given in and revoked his decree. But by then, his soldiers had already started setting their own personal plans in motion, without any sort of central coordination. After being told all the plans, or what his soldiers claimed were their plans, Draco had tried to sketch a plot to win the final battle. It had required considerably more than 3 different things to go right, and Draco had used incendio on the paper and Everto to vanish the ashes, because if Father had seen it, he would have been disowned. Professor Quirrell's eyelids were half closed, his chin resting on his hands as he leaned forward onto his desk. "And you, Mr. Potter," said the defense professor, "are you likewise in agreement? All we'd need to do is shoot Franz Ferdinand, and we could start World War I," said Harry. "Gone to complete chaos, I'm all for it." "Harry," said Draco in utter shock. He didn't even realize until a second later that he'd said it at exactly the same time, and in exactly the same tone of indignation as Granger. Granger shot him a startled glance, and Draco carefully kept his face neutral. "Oops, that's right," said Harry. "I'm betraying you, both of you, again. Ha ha!" Professor Quirrell was smiling thinly, though his eyes were still half closed. "And why is that, Mr. Potter?" "Because I think I can cope with the chaos better than Miss Granger or Mr. Malfoy," said the traitor. "A war is a zero-sum game, and it doesn't matter whether it's easy or hard in an absolute sense, only who does better or worse." Harry Potter was learning far too fast. Professor Quirrell's eyes moved beneath their lids to regard Draco, and then Granger. "In truth, Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, I simply could not live with myself if I shut down the grand debacle before its climax. One of your soldiers has even become a quadruple agent." "Quadruple," said Granger. "But there's only 3 sides in the war." "Yes," said Professor Quirrell. "You think that, wouldn't you? I am not sure that there has ever in history been a quadruple agent, or any army with such a high fraction of real and pretended traitors. We are exploring new realms, Miss Granger, and we cannot turn back now." Draco left the defense professor's office with his teeth gritting hard against each other, and Granger looking even more annoyed beside him. "I can't believe you did that, Harry," said Granger. "Sorry," Harry said, not sounding sorry at all, his lips curved up in a merry smile of evil. "Remember, Hermione, it is just a game, and why should generals like us be the only ones who get to plot? And besides, what are the 2 of you going to do about it? Team up against me?" Draco traded glances with Granger, knowing that his own face was as tight as hers. Harry had been relying, more and more openly and gloatingly, on Draco's refusal to make common cause with a mudblood girl, and Draco was beginning to get sick of having that used against him. If this kept up much longer, he was going to ally with Granger just to crush Harry Potter, and see how much the son of a mudblood liked that. The terrifying part was how fast the whole thing had spiraled out of control. Hermione stared at the parchment Zabini had given her, feeling utterly and completely helpless. There were names, and lines connecting the names to other names, and some of the lines were in different colors and— "Tell me," said General Granger, "is there anyone in my army who isn't a spy?" The 2 of them weren't in the office, but in another, deserted classroom, and they were alone. Because, Colonel Zabini had said, it was now nearly certain that at least one of the captains was a traitor. Probably Captain Goldstein, but Zabini didn't know for sure. Her question had put an ironic smile on the young Slytherin's face. Blaise Zabini always seemed a little disdainful of her, but he didn't seem to actively dislike her. Nothing like the derision he held for Draco Malfoy or the resentment he had developed for Harry Potter. She had worried at first about Zabini betraying her, but the boy seemed desperate to show that the other 2 generals were no better than him. And Hermione thought that while Zabini would probably be happy to sell her out to anyone else, he'd never let Malfoy or Harry win. "Most of your soldiers are still loyal to you, I'm pretty sure," said Zabini. "It's just that no one wants to be left out of the fun." Scornful look on the Slytherin's face made it clear what he thought of people who didn't take plotting seriously. "So they think they can be double agents and secretly work for our side while pretending to betray us. And that would also go for anyone in the other armies who says they want to be our spy," Hermione said carefully. The young Slytherin shrugged. "I think I did a good job of telling which ones really want to sell out Malfoy. I'm not sure anyone really wants to sell out Potter to you. But Nart is a sure bet for betraying Potter to Malfoy, and since I had Entwistle approach him, supposedly on behalf of Malfoy, and Entwistle really reports to us, that's almost as good." Hermione closed her eyes for a moment. "We're going to lose, aren't we?" "Look," Zabini said patiently, "you're in the lead right now on Quirrell points. We just have to not lose this last battle completely, and you'll have enough Quirrell points to win the Christmas wish." Professor Quirrell had announced that the final battle would operate on a formal scoring system, which he'd been asked to do to avoid recriminations afterward. Each time you shot someone, the general of your army got 2 Quirrell points. A gong would ring through the battle area, They didn't know yet where they would be fighting, though Hermione was hoping for the forest again, where Sunshine did well, and its pitch would tell which army had won the points. And if anyone was faking being hit, the gong would ring out anyway, and then a double gong would ring later after no fixed time to hail the retraction. And if you called the name of an army, cried for Sunshine, or for Chaos, or for Dragon, it switched your allegiance to that army. Even Hermione had been able to see the flaw in that set of rules. But Professor Quirrell had gone on to announce that if you'd been originally assigned to Sunshine, nobody could shoot you in the name of Sunshine, or rather, they could. But then Sunshine lost a single Quirrell point, symbolized by a triple gong. That prevented you from shooting your own soldiers for points and discouraged suiciding before the enemy got you, but you could still shoot spies if you had to. Right now, Hermione had 244 Quirrell points, and Malfoy had 219, and Harry had 221, and there were 24 soldiers in each army. So we fight carefully, Hermione said, and just try not to lose too badly. No, said Zabini. The young Slytherin's face was now serious. The problem is, Malfoy and Potter both know that their only way to win is to combine and crush us, then fight it out on their own. So here's what I think we should do. Hermione left the classroom in something of a daze. Zabini's plan hadn't been the obvious one. It had been strange and complicated and layered, and the sort of thing she would have expected Harry to come up with, not Zabini. It felt wrong just for her to be able to understand a plan like that. Young girls shouldn't be able to understand plans like that. The hat would have sorted her into Slytherin if it had seen that she could understand plans like that. The awesome thing was how fast he'd been able to escalate the chaos once he started doing it deliberately. Harry sat in his office. He'd been given the authority to order furniture from the house elves, so he'd ordered a throne and curtains in a black and crimson pattern. Scarlet light like blood, mixed with shadow, poured over the floor. Something in Harry felt like he'd finally come home. Before him stood the 4 lieutenants of chaos, his most trusted minions, one of whom was a traitor. This was what life should be like. We are gathered, said Harry. Let chaos reign, chorused his 4 lieutenants. My hovercraft is full of eels, said Harry. I will not buy this record, it is scratched, chorused his 4 lieutenants. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome wraths out grabe, that concluded the formalities. How goes the confusion? Harry said in a dry whisper like Emperor Palpatine. It goes well, General Chaos, said Neville in the tone he always used for military matters, a tone so deep that the boy often had to stop and cough. The chaotic lieutenant was neatly dressed in his black school robes, trimmed in the yellow of Hufflepuff House, and his hair was parted and combed in the usual look for an earnest young boy. Harry had liked the incongruity better than any of the cloaks they'd tried. Our legionnaires have begun 5 new plots since yesterday evening. Harry smiled evilly. Do any of them have a chance of working? I don't think so, said Neville of Chaos. Here's the report. Excellent, said Harry, and laughed chillingly as he took the parchment from Neville's hand, trying his best to make it sound like he was choking on dust. That brought the total to 60. Let Draco try to handle that. Let him try, and as for Blaise Zabini. Harry laughed again, and this time it didn't even take an effort to sound evil. He really needed to borrow someone's pet Kneasel for his staff meetings, so he'd have a cat to stroke while he did this. Can the Legion stop making plots now? Said Finnegan of Chaos. I mean, don't we have enough already? No, Harry said flatly. We can never have enough plots. Professor Quirrell had put it perfectly. They were pushing the boundaries further, perhaps, than they had ever been pushed, and Harry wouldn't have been able to live with himself if he turned back now. There came a knock at the door. That will be the Dragon General, Harry said, smiling with evil prescience. He arrives precisely as I expected. Do show him in and yourselves out. And the 4 lieutenants of Chaos shuffled out, casting dark looks at Draco as the enemy general entered into Harry's secret lair. If he wasn't allowed to do this when he was older, Harry was just going to stay 11 forever. The sun was dripping through the red curtains, sending rays of blood dancing across the floor from behind Harry Potter's grown-up-sized cushioned chair, which he had covered in gold and silver glitter, and insisted on referring to as his throne. Draco was beginning to feel a lot more confident that he'd done the right thing in deciding to overthrow Harry Potter before he could take over the world. Draco couldn't even imagine what it would be like to live under his rule. "Good evening, Dragon General," said Harry Potter in a chill whisper. "You have arrived just as I expected." This was not surprising, considering that Draco and Harry had agreed on the meeting time in advance. And it also wasn't evening, but by now Draco knew better than to say anything. "General Potter," Draco said, with as much dignity as he could manage, "you know that our two armies have to work together for either of us to win Professor Quirrell's wish, right?" "Yes," hissed Harry, like the boy thought he was a Parselmouth. "We must cooperate to destroy Sunshine, and only then fight it out between us. But if one of us betrays the other earlier on, that one could gain an advantage in the later fight. And the Sunshine General, who knows all this, will try to trick each of us into thinking the other has betrayed them. And you and I, who know that, will be tempted to betray the other and pretend that it is Granger's trickery. And Granger knows that as well." Draco nodded. That much was obvious. "And both of us only want to win, and there's no one else who will punish either of us if we defect." "Precisely," said Harry Potter, his face now turning serious. "We are faced with a true prisoner's dilemma." The prisoner's dilemma, according to Harry's teachings, ran thus. Two prisoners had been locked in separate cells. There was evidence against each prisoner, but only minor evidence, enough for a prison sentence of 2 years apiece. Each prisoner could opt to defect, betray the other, testify against them in court, and this would take 1 year off their own prison sentence, but add 2 years to the others. Or a prisoner could cooperate, staying silent. So if both prisoners defected, each testifying against the other, they would serve 3 years apiece. If both cooperated or stayed silent, they would serve 2 years each. But if one defected and the other cooperated, the defector would serve a single year, and the cooperator would serve 4. And both prisoners had to make their decision without knowing the other one's choice, and neither would be given a chance to change their decision afterward. Draco had observed that if the two prisoners had been Death Eaters during the Wizarding War, the Dark Lord would have killed any traitors. Harry had nodded and said that was one way to resolve the prisoner's dilemma, and in fact, both Death Eaters would want there to be a Dark Lord for exactly that reason. Draco had asked Harry to stop and let him to think about this for a while before they continued. It had explained a lot about why Father and his friends had agreed to serve under a Dark Lord who often wasn't nice to them. In fact, Harry had said, this was pretty much the reason why people had governments. You might be better off if you stole from someone else, just like each prisoner would be individually better off if they defected in the prisoner's dilemma. But if everyone thought like that, the country would fall into chaos, and everyone would be worse off, like what would happen if both prisoners defected. So people let themselves be ruled by governments, just like the Death Eaters had let themselves be ruled by the Dark Lord. Draco had asked Harry to stop again. Draco had always taken for granted that ambitious wizards put themselves in power because they wanted to rule, and people let themselves be ruled because they were scared little Hufflepuffs. And this, on reflection, still seemed true, but Harry's perspective was fascinating even if it was wrong. But, Harry had continued afterward, the fear of a third party punishing you was not the only possible reason to cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma, suppose. Harry had said, you were playing the game against a magically produced identical copy of yourself. Draco had said that if there were two Dracos, of course neither Draco would want anything bad to happen to the other one, not to mention that no Malfoy would let himself become known as a traitor. Harry had nodded again, and said that this was yet another solution to the prisoner's dilemma. People might cooperate because they cared about each other, or because they had senses of honor, or because they wanted to preserve their reputation. Indeed, Harry had said, it was rather difficult to construct a true prisoner's dilemma in real life. People usually cared about the other person, or their honor, or their reputation, or a Dark Lord's punishment, or something besides the prison sentences. But suppose the copy had been of someone completely selfish. Pansy Parkinson had been the example they'd used. So each pansy only cared what happened to her and not to the other pansy, given that this was all Pansy cared about. And that there was no Dark Lord, and Pansy wasn't worried about her reputation. And Pansy either had no sense of honor or didn't consider herself obligated to the other prisoner. Then would the rational thing be for Pansy to cooperate or defect? Some people, Harry said, claim that the rational thing to do was for Pansy to defect against her copy, but Harry, plus someone named Douglas Hofstadter, thought these people were wrong. Because, Harry had said, if Pansy defected, not at random, but for what seemed to her like rational reasons, then the other Pansy would think exactly the same way. Two identical copies wouldn't decide different things. So Pansy had to choose between a world in which both Pansies cooperated or a world in which both Pansies defected, and she was better off if both copies cooperated. And if Harry had thought, rational, people did defect in the prisoner's dilemma, then he wouldn't have done anything to spread that kind of rationality, because a country or a conspiracy full of rational people would dissolve into chaos. You would tell your enemies about rationality, which had all sounded reasonable at the time, but now the thought was occurring to Draco that. You said, Draco said, that the rational solution to the prisoner's dilemma is to cooperate. Of course you would want me to believe that, wouldn't you? And if Draco was fooled into cooperating, Harry would just say, "Ha ha, betrayed you again," and laugh at him about it afterward. I wouldn't fake your lessons, Harry said seriously. But I have to remind you, Draco, that I didn't say you should just automatically cooperate. Not on a true prisoner's dilemma like this one. What I said was that when you choose, you shouldn't think like you're choosing for just yourself, or like you're choosing for everyone. You should think like you're choosing for all the people who are similar enough to you that they'll probably do the same thing you do for the same reasons. And also choosing the predictions made by anyone who knows you well enough to predict you accurately, so that you never have to regret being rational because of the correct predictions that other people make about you. Remind me to explain about Newcomb's problem at some point. So the question you and I have to ask, Draco, is this. Are we similar enough that we'll probably do the same thing whatever it is, making our decisions in mostly the same way? Or do we know each other well enough to predict each other, so that I can predict whether you'll cooperate or defect, and you can predict that I've decided to do the same thing I predict you'll do, because I know that you can predict me deciding that? And Draco could not help but think that since he had to strain just to understand half of that, the answer was obviously no. Yes, said Draco. There was a pause. I see, said Harry, sounding disappointed. Oh, well, I guess we'll have to think of some other way then. Draco hadn't thought that was going to work. Draco and Harry talked about it back and forth. They had both agreed much earlier that what they did on the battlefield would not count as broken promises in real life, though Draco was a little angry about what Harry had done in Professor Quirrell's office, and said so. But if the two of them couldn't rely on honor or friendship, that did leave the question of how to get their armies to work together on beating Sunshine, despite everything Granger might try to break them up. Professor Quirrell's rules didn't make it tempting to let Sunshine kill the other army's soldiers. That just increased the bar you had to pass yourself. But it did tempt each side to steal kills instead of acting like a single army would, or to shoot some of the other side's soldiers during the confusion of battle. Hermione was walking back to Ravenclaw, not really looking where she was going, her mind preoccupied with war and treachery and other age-inappropriate concepts, and she turned a corner and bumped straight into a grown-up. Sorry, she said automatically, and then entirely without thinking, Eek. Don't worry, Miss Granger, said the cheerful smile, set beneath the twinkling eyes and above the silver beard of the headmaster of Hogwarts. You're quite forgiven. Her gaze was helplessly locked on the kindly face of the most powerful wizard in the world, who was also the chief warlock, who was also the supreme mugwump, who had gone insane years ago from the stress of fighting the Dark Lord, and numerous other facts that were popping up into her mind, one after the other, while her throat went on making little embarrassing squeaks. In fact, Miss Granger, said Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, it is quite lucky that we bumped into each other. Why, I was just now wondering curiously what the three of you were thinking of asking for your wishes. Saturday dawned bright and clear, and with the students speaking in hushed voices, as though the first to shout might set off the explosion. Draco had hoped that they would be fighting in the upper levels of Hogwarts again. Professor Quirrell had said that real fights were more likely to take place in cities than forests, and fighting inside schoolrooms and corridors was supposed to simulate that, with ribbons to mark the allowed areas. Dragon Army had done well in those fights, Instead, just as Draco had feared, Professor Quirrell had come up with something special for this battle. The battleground was the Hogwarts lake, and not in boats either. They were fighting underwater. The giant squid had been temporarily paralyzed. Spells had been set in place to keep away the Grindylows. Professor Quirrell had gone and talked to the merfolk, and all the soldiers had been issued potions of underwater action that allowed them to breathe, see clearly, talk to each other, and swim not quite as fast as a fast walk by kicking their legs. A huge silver sphere hung in the center of the battleground, shining like a small underwater moon. It would help to provide a sense of direction at first. The moon would slowly go into eclipse as the battle went on, and when it had gone entirely dark, the battle would end if it hadn't already. War in water. You couldn't defend a perimeter, attackers could come at you from any direction, and even with the potion you couldn't see very far in the darkness of the lake. And if you swam too far away from the action, you would start to glow after a while, and be easy to hunt down. Ordinarily, if an army scattered and ran instead of fighting, Professor Quirrell would just declare them defeated. But today they were working on a point system. Of course, you still had some time before you started to glow if you wanted to play assassin. Dragon Army had been set low in the water at the start of the game. Above and far away, the distant underwater moon shone. The murky water was mostly lit by Lumo's charms, though his soldiers would extinguish the lights as soon as they began maneuvers. There was no point in letting the enemy see you before you saw them. Draco kicked his legs a few times, propelling him to a higher position from which he could gaze down at where his soldiers hovered in the water. The conversations died down almost at once under Draco's icy glare, his soldiers looking up at him with gratifying expressions of fear and worry. "Listen to me very carefully," said General Malfoy. His voice came out a little lower, a little burbly with bubbles. "Listen to me very carefully," but the sound traveled clearly. "There's only one way we can win this. We've got to march on Sunshine together with Chaos and beat Sunshine. Then we fight it out with Potter and win. That's got to happen, understand? No matter what else goes on, that part has to happen that way." And Draco explained the plan he and Harry had come up with. Astonished looks were exchanged among the soldiers. "And if any of your plots get in the way of that," finished Draco, "after we are out of the water, I will set you on fire." There was a nervous chorus of yes-sirs. "And everyone with secret orders, make sure you carry them out to the letter," said Draco. Around half his soldiers openly nodded, and Draco marked them for death after he rose to power. Of course, all the private orders were fake, like one dragon being told to offer a false traitor's commission to another dragon, and the second dragon being told, in hushed confidence, to report anything said by the first dragon. Draco had told each dragon that the whole war could depend on that one thing, and that he hoped they understood it was more important than the plans they'd previously made. With luck, that would keep all the idiots happy, and maybe flush out a few spies to boot if the reports didn't match the instructions. Draco's real plan for winning against Chaos. Well, it was simpler than the one he'd burned, but Father still wouldn't have liked it. Despite trying, though, Draco hadn't been able to think of anything better. It was a plot that couldn't possibly have worked against anyone except Harry Potter. In fact, it had been Harry's plan originally, according to the traitor, though Draco had guessed that without being told. Draco and the traitor had just modified it a little. Harry took a deep breath, feeling the water gurgle harmlessly in his lungs. They'd fought in the forest, and he hadn't gotten a chance to say it. They'd fought in the corridors of Hogwarts, and he hadn't gotten a chance to say it. They'd fought in the air, broomsticks issued to every soldier, and it still hadn't made sense to say it. Harry had thought he wouldn't ever get to say those words, not while he was still young enough for them to be real. The Chaos Legionnaires were looking at Harry in puzzlement as their general swam with his feet pointing up toward the distant light of the surface, and his head pointed down toward the murky depths. "Why are you upside down?" The young commander shouted at his army and began to explain how to fight after you abandoned the privileged orientation of gravity. A hollow, booming bell echoed through the water, and on the instant, Zabini and Anthony and 5 other soldiers struck out downward into the murky depths of the lake. Parvati Patil, the only Gryffindor in the group, turned her head back for a moment and gave them all a cheery wave as she dived, and after a moment, Scott and Matt did the same. The rest just sank and vanished. General Granger swallowed a lump in her throat as she watched them go. He was risking everything on this, dividing her army instead of just trying to take as many enemy soldiers with them as possible. The thing to realize, Zabini had told her, was that no army would move until they had a plan that let them expect victory. Sunshine couldn't just plan to win themselves. They had to make both other armies think they would win until it was too late. Ernie and Ron still looked like they were in shock. Susan was gazing after the disappearing soldiers with a calculating look. Her army, what was left of it, just looked bewildered, traceries of light dappling on their uniforms as they all drifted just below the sunlit surface of the lake. "Now what?" said Ron. "Now we wait," said Hermione, loudly enough for all the soldiers to hear. It felt hard to talk with her mouth full of water. She kept feeling like she was committing some sort of horrible impoliteness at the dinner table and was about to drool all over herself. All of us left here are going to get zapped, but that was going to happen anyway with Dragon and Chaos ganging up on us. We've just got to take as many of them with us as we can. "I've got a plan," said one of her Sunshine soldiers. Hannah, her voice had been a little hard to recognize at first. "It's like all complicated, but I know how we can get Dragon and Chaos to start fighting each other." "Me too," said Faye. "I've got a plan too." "See, Neville Longbottom is secretly on our side. You were talking to Neville," said Ernie. "That's not right. I was the one who, Daphne Greengrass and a couple of other Slytherins who hadn't gone with Zabini were giggling helplessly as the cries of 'No, wait.' I was the one who got Longbottom," erupted from one soldier after another. Hermione just looked at them all wearily. "Okay," said Hermione when it had all died down. "Does everyone get it? All your plots were faked by the Chaos Legion, or maybe some by Dragon. Anyone who really wanted to betray Harry or Malfoy went straight to me or Zabini, not you. Just go ahead and compare notes on all your secret plots, and you'll see it for yourselves. She might not be as good at plotting as Zabini, but she could always understand what all her officers told her. That was why Professor Quirrell had made her the general. So don't bother trying to do any plots when the other armies get here. Just fight, okay, please." "But," said Ernie with shock on his face, "Neville is in Hufflepuff. You're saying he lied to us." Daphne was laughing so hard and so helplessly that the exhalations had turned her upside down in the water. "I'm not sure what Longbottom is," said Ron darkly, "but I don't think he's a Hufflepuff anymore, not now that Harry Potter's got to him." "Do you know," said Susan, "I asked him that, and Neville told me he had become a Chaos Hufflepuff." "Anyway," said Hermione in a loud voice, "Zabini took with everyone who we thought was a spy, so in our army we can stop watching each other quite so hard now, I hope." "Anthony was a spy," yelled Ron. "Parvati was a spy," gasped Hannah. "Parvati was totally a spy," said Daphne. "She shopped at the spy shoe store and wore spy lipstick, and someday she's going to marry a nice spy husband and have a lot of little spies." And then a gong sound echoed through the water, indicating that Sunshine had just scored 2 points. This was shortly followed by the triple gong of Dragon losing a single point. Traitors weren't allowed to kill generals, not after the disaster of the first battle in December when all 3 generals had been shot in the first minute. But with any luck— "Oh," said Hermione, "it sounds like Mr. Crabbe is taking a little nap." Like 2 shoals of fish, the armies swam along. Neville Longbottom kicked his feet in slow, measured motions. Diving, always diving in whatever direction you happened to be moving. You wanted to show the enemy the smallest profile, present them with your head or your feet. So you were always diving, downward and head first, and the enemy was always down. Like every Chaos Legionnaire in the army, Neville's head was constantly rotating as he swam, looking up, down, around, to every side. Not just watching for Sunshine soldiers, but watching for any sign that a Chaos Legionnaire had drawn their wand and was about to betray them. Usually traitors waited until the confusion of battle to make their move, but that early gong had put them all on guard. The truth was, Neville was feeling sad about that. In November, he'd been a soldier in a united army, all of them pulling together and helping each other, and now they were all watching each other constantly for the first signs of betrayal. It might have been more fun for General Chaos, but it wasn't nearly as much fun for Neville. The direction formerly known as up was getting steadily brighter as they came closer to the surface and sunshine. "Wands out," said General Chaos. Neville's squad drew their wands, pointing them straight ahead toward the enemy as their heads scanned around more rapidly. If there were sunny traitors, the time was approaching for them to strike. The other shoal of fish, dragon army, was doing the same thing. Now, shouted the distant voice of the dragon general. Now, shouted General Chaos. For sunshine, shouted all the soldiers in both armies and charged downward. What? Said Minerva involuntarily as she watched the screens from next to the lake. A cry echoed in many other places. All of Hogwarts was watching this battle as they had watched the first. Professor Quirrell was laughing dryly. I warned you, Headmaster. It is impossible to have rules without Mr. Potter exploiting them. For long, precious seconds, as the 47 soldiers charged her own 17, Hermione's mind went blank. Why? Then it all snapped into place. Every time a soldier originally from Sunshine got shot by someone crying the name of Sunshine, she would lose a Quirrell point. When 2 Sunshine soldiers were shot by either army, both enemy armies would be 2 points closer to overtaking her. It was the same gain, only shared. And if anyone shot another soldier not in the name of Sunshine, that gong wouldn't get lost in the confusion. Hermione was suddenly very glad that Zabini hadn't gone with the obvious plan of starting trouble between the other 2 armies while they attacked Sunshine. It was still disheartening, though, that sense of your chances closing down, of hope being taken away. Most of Hermione's soldiers were still looking confused, but some had expressions of dawning horror as they got it. Right, Susan Bones said firmly. Heads turned to look at the Sunshine Captain. Our job is the same, to take as many of them with us as we can. And remember, Zabini took away all the spies. We don't have to stay on the lookout like they do. The girl was smiling defiantly, provoking answering smiles from many of the other soldiers, even from Hermione herself. It can be like it was in November. We just have to keep our heads high, fight our best, and trust each other, Daphne shot her. Blood for the Blood Guard, shrieked Neville of Chaos, though since he was under water it came out more like blubbled for the blubbled glub. Captain Weasley spun and raised his wand toward Neville and fired. But Neville was swimming downward toward him, wand pointed straight ahead, and that meant the simple shield could shelter Neville's entire profile. If anyone shot him now, it wasn't going to be Sunny Ron. A grimly determined look came over Captain Weasley's face, and he arrowed straight up toward Neville, mouthing the word Contigo, though the shield wasn't visible in the water. The 2 enemy champions shot toward each other like arrows released from bows, each aimed to split the other down the middle. They had dueled many times before, but this time would pay for all. Far away by the lakeside, 100 breaths were held. Rainbows and unicorns, roared the Sunshine Captain. The black goat with 1,000 young. Do your homework. Closer and yet closer, the 2 champions charged, neither willing to swerve. The first person to turn would present a vulnerable broadside and get shot, though if neither lost their nerve, they would crash right into each other. Falling straight down as the enemy rose straight up to meet him, Hammer descending to meet Anvil in a path neither was willing to leave. Special attack, chaotic twist. Neville saw the look of horror on Captain Weasley's face as the hover charm caught him. They'd tested it before the battle had started, and just as Harry had suspected, Wingardium Leviosa became a whole new sort of weapon once everyone was swimming underwater. Curse you, Longbottom, shrieked Ron Weasley. Can't you ever fight without your dumb special attacks? And by that time, the Sunshine Captain had been spun around sideways, and Neville shot him in the leg. I don't fight fair, said Neville to the sleeping form. I fight like Harry Potter. Granger, 237/Malfoy, 217/Potter, 220. It still hurt every time he had to shoot Hermione. Harry could hardly stand to look at the expression of peace that had come over her sleeping face, arms now drifting aimlessly as the curves of sunlight moved over her camouflage uniform and the cloud of her chestnut hair. And if Harry had tried to duck out of being the one to shoot her, not only would Draco have known what it meant, Hermione would have been offended. She's not dead, Harry said to his brain as his kicking feet pushed him away. She's just resting. Idiot. Are you sure? Said his brain. What if she's an ex-Hermione? Could we go back and check? Harry glanced back briefly. See, she's fine. There are bubbles coming out of her mouth. Could have been her last breath escaping. Oh, be quiet. Why are you being so paranoid protective anyway? First real friend we've ever had in our whole life. Hey, remember what happened to our pet rock? Would you shut up about that worthless lump of rubble? It wasn't even alive, let alone sentient. That is like the most pathetic childhood trauma ever. The two armies swiftly separated, becoming two shoals of fish once more. General Granger had gone down 17 points and taken 3 chaotics and 2 dragons with her, and 1 chaotic and 2 dragons had been shot as traitors. So she'd lost net 7 points. Harry had lost 1. Draco had lost 2. That put Sunshine 20 points up on Dragon and 17 points up on Chaos. Chaos could still win easily if they exterminated all 20 remaining dragons. The wild card, of course, being those 7 remaining Sunshine soldiers, if you could call them that. The two shoals swam uneasily next to each other, the soldiers in each army awaiting an order to call out their true allegiances and attack. "Everyone who got them," Harry said loudly. "Remember special orders 1 through 3. And don't forget it's Merlin says on 3. Do not acknowledge." The trustworthy 2/3 of the army did not nod, and the other third just looked puzzled. Special Order 1. Don't bother trying to call out any code words in this battle. Don't expend effort on any plot not specially approved by the commander. Just swim, shield, and fire. Hermione and Draco had both been fighting their soldiers, trying to get them to stop plotting on their own all through December. Harry had egged his soldiers on and supported their plotting through the last 2 battles, while also telling them that at some future point he might ask them to put a plot or 2 on hold, to which they'd all readily agreed. So now, in this critical battle, they were happy to obey. Neither Hermione or Draco could have given that order successfully, Harry was certain. It was the difference between your soldiers seeing you as an ally in their plotting and seeing you as a spoilsport old fuddy-duddy who didn't want them to have any fun. Imposition of order equaled escalation of chaos, and it also worked in reverse. "There they are," shouted someone, and pointed. From the depths of the lake arose the forgotten ones, the ones who'd forsaken the last battle, the 7 missing Sunshine soldiers, glowing with the bright aura of cowards, now fading as they returned to battle. The 2 shoals of fish wavered, pointing wands uneasily. "Hold your fire," shouted Harry, and a similar cry came from General Malfoy. There was a moment of held breath. Then the 7 Sunshine soldiers swam up to join Dragon Army. There was a triumphant cheer from Dragon Army. There were cries of dismay from a third of the Chaos Legion. Some of the other 2/3 smiled, though they shouldn't have. Harry wasn't smiling. Oh, this is so completely not going to work. But Harry hadn't been able to think of anything better. "Special Orders 2 and 3 still apply," shouted Harry. "Fight! For the Chaos Legion," roared 20 Chaotic Legionnaires. "For Dragon Army," roared 20 Dragon Warriors and 7 Sunshine Soldiers. And the Chaotix dived straight downward as all the traitors got ready to strike. Granger, 237/Malfoy, 220/Potter. 226 Draco's head darted around frantically, trying to weigh up what was happening. Somehow, despite his greater forces, he'd lost the initiative. 4 small chaotic forces were being pursued by 4 larger dragon forces, but because Draco's forces were the ones trying to force an engagement, it meant that they had to follow where chaos ran, and somehow that was producing concentrations of chaotic force that would fire into the exposed sides of Dragon. It was happening again. "Prismates," shouted Draco, raising his wand, and that shield you could see even through the water, a sparkling multicolored flat wall wide enough to shield Draco and the 5 other dragons with him from the chaotic force that had just started firing on them as they swam past, and that let the other 5 dragons turn their attentions back to the chaotic force they'd been chasing. There was a tense moment as sleep spell after sleep spell crashed into Draco's prismatic wall. And Draco was hoping to Merlin that none of those 4 chaotics had learned the breaking drill hex. Then there was the bell of a dragon victory, and the chaotic force spun head for foot and began swimming away. And Draco, his hands now shaking slightly, dropped the prismatic wall and lowered his wand. Fighting in water was more exhausting even than fighting on broomsticks. "Do not pursue," Draco cried to his soldiers as they started to follow then. "Sonorous, reform on me." The dragon forces started converging on Draco, and the chaotic forces spun around and began pursuing the dragons. On the instant, Draco swore out loud as he heard the bell of a chaotic victory. Someone hadn't gotten their simple shield oriented right. And then the dragon forces were in supporting range of each other, and the chaotics were moving back into the murky distance. Somehow, despite their numerical superiority, The dragons had scored 3 times against the chaotics, and the chaotics had scored 4 times back, and he'd heard one dragon spy get executed. Either Harry Potter had thought of a lot of very good ideas very fast, or for some unimaginable reason, he'd already spent a lot of time working out how to fight underwater. This wasn't working, and Draco needed to rethink things. It looked like everyone was having trouble aiming while swimming, too. The battle might last long enough that time would be called. The distant underwater moon was only half full now. That wasn't good. He had to rethink things fast. "What is it?" said Padma Patil, as she and her force swam over toward Draco. Padma was his second in command. She was clever and powerful, and better yet, she hated Granger and saw Harry as a rival, which made her trustworthy. Working with Padma was making him realize the truth of the old adage that Ravenclaw was sister to Slytherin. Draco had been surprised when his father had told him it was an acceptable house for his future wife, but now he saw the sense of it. "Wait until we're all here," Draco said. The truth was, he needed to catch his breath. That was the trouble with being the general and the most powerful wizard. You had to keep using magic. Zabini came in next, commanding a force of 2 Sunnies and 4 dragons, one of whom was Gregory, keeping an eye on Zabini. Draco didn't trust Zabini. And neither Draco nor Zabini trusted the Sunnies enough to make them a majority of any unit. They were supposed to be loyal either to Draco directly, or to Granger, who'd been fooled by the promise that the dragons would be betrayed in the end after both forces had been depleted, just as Harry's more trusted chaotics should have been fooled into not shooting at the Sunnies by the promise of their firing fake sleep hexes and switching to support chaos later. But it was possible some of the Sunnies were loyal to chaos and weren't firing real sleep hexes, and that was why Dragon wasn't winning the way their numerical advantage should have let them win. The next unit that approached was depleted, 3 soldiers holding wands on 2 other soldiers who were swimming with empty hands. Draco gritted his teeth. More traitor problems. He needed to talk to Professor Quirrell about having some way to punish traitors at least. Conditions like these were unrealistic. In real life, you tortured your traitors to death. "General Malfoy," shouted the commander of the problem unit as it swam up, a Ravenclaw boy named Terry. "We don't know what to do. Ceci shot Bogdan, but Ceci says Keller told him that Bogdan shot Spectre." "I didn't," said Keller. "Yes, you did," shrieked Ceci. "General Malfoy, she's the spy. I should have Somnium," said Draco. There was the triple bell of a 1-point loss from Dragon, and then Keller's limp body began to float away in the water. Draco had heard the word recursion by this point, and he knew a Harry Potter plot when he saw one. Unfortunately, Draco had not heard of autoimmune disorders, and the thought did not readily occur to him that a clever virus would begin its attack by creating symptoms of an autoimmune disorder so as to get the body to distrust its own immune system. "General order," said Draco, raising his voice. "Nobody gets to shoot spies except myself, Gregory, Padma, and Terry. If anyone sees anything suspicious, they come to one of us." And then there was the Bell of Sunshine scoring 2 points. "What?" said Draco and Zabini around the same time, their heads swiveled around. No one seemed to have gotten hit, and all the Sunshine soldiers were present and accounted for, except Parvati, who had been shot by some still unknown traitor in Padma's squad. And of course Padma had shot Parvati again in case she was faking, so it wasn't her. "A Sunny traitor in chaos," said Zabini, sounding puzzled. "But all the ones I knew about were supposed to strike during Chaos's attack on Sunshine." "No," said Padma in a tone of sudden realization. "That was Chaos executing a spy." "What?" said Zabini. "But why?" And Draco got it. "Damn it. Because Potter thinks he's safe for how much he beats Sunshine, but not for how much he beats us. So he doesn't want to lose a single point when he executes a traitor. General order. If you have to execute a traitor, call Sunshine first. And don't forget to switch back to Dragon afterward, Granger. 253/Malfoy. 252/Potter. 252 Longbottom's body drifted chaotically through the water, arms and legs disarrayed. After Draco had finally got a hit in, they'd all shot him again just to be sure. Nearby was Harry Potter, now protected by a prismatic sphere, looking at them all grimly as the last sliver of crescent moon slowly diminished, somewhere far away. If Longbottom had managed to shoot one more soldier, Draco knew Harry was thinking. If the two chaotics had managed to hold out just a little longer, they might have won. After Draco had reformed his forces and struck out again, the ensuing battle and execution of spies in Sunshine's name had left Sunshine exactly 1 point ahead of Dragon and Chaos both. Once Harry had started doing it, Draco had been left with no choice but to follow suit. But now they had General Chaos outnumbered 3-1, the survivors of Dragon Army and the last remaining Sunny traitor, Draco and Padma and Zabini. And Draco, who was no fool, had ordered Padma to take Zabini's wand after Longbottom had shot Gregory and fallen in turn to Draco. The boy had given him an insulted look, told Draco that he owed him for this, and handed it over. That left Draco and Padma to take down General Chaos. "I don't suppose you'd like to surrender," said Draco, smiling as evilly as any smile he'd ever directed at Harry Potter. "Sleep before surrender," shouted General Chaos. "Just so you know," said Draco, "Zabini doesn't actually have an older sister for you to rescue from Gryffindor bullies. But Zabini does have a mother who doesn't approve of Muggleborns like Granger, and I wrote her a few notes and offered Zabini a few favors, nothing involving my father, just things I can do in school. And by the way, Zabini's mother doesn't approve of the boy who lived, either, just in case you still thought Zabini was really on your side." Harry's face grew even grimmer. Draco raised his wand and began breathing rhythmically, building up strength for a breaking drill. Hex Granger's prismatic sphere was almost as strong as Draco's now, and Harry's wasn't much weaker. Where did those two find time? "Lagan," spoke Draco, putting everything he had into it, and the green spiral blazed out and Harry's shield shattered. And at almost the same moment, "Somnium," said Padma. Granger, 253/Malfoy, 252/Potter, 254. Harry let out a long breath of relief, and not just because he didn't have to hold the prismatic sphere anymore. His hand was shaking as he lowered his wand. "You know," said Harry, "I was pretty worried there for a moment." Special Order 2. If a Sunny traitor doesn't seem to be really shooting at you, fake being hit occasionally. Prefer targeting dragons to Sunnies, but go ahead and shoot Sunnies if you can't shoot dragons. Special Order 3. Merlin says do not shoot at Blaze, Zabini, or either Patel twin. With a wide grin, Parvati Patel stripped the transfigured patch off her uniform's insignia and let it float away in the water. "Gryffindors for chaos," she said, and handed Zabini his wand back. "Thank you very much," Harry said, and bowed sweepingly to the Gryffindor girl. "And thank you as well," bowing to Zabini. "You know, when you came to me with that plan, I wondered if you were brilliant or crazy, and I've decided that you're both. And by the way," Harry said, now turning as though to address Draco's body, "Zabini does have a cousin, Somnium," said Zabini's voice. Granger, 255/Malfoy, 252/Potter, 254, and Harry Potter's body floated away, his expression of shock and horror quickly relaxing into sleep. "On second thought," Parvati said cheerfully, "make that Gryffindors for Sunshine." She started to laugh, more exhilarated than she'd ever been in her life. She'd finally gotten to assassinate and replace her twin sister, and she wanted to do that since forever, and this had been perfect. It had all been perfect. And then her wand spun around in a lightning motion just as Zabini's wand turned to point at her. "Wait," said Zabini. "Do not shoot, do not resist. That's an order." "What?" said Parvati. "Sorry," said Zabini, looking not quite sincerely apologetic, "but I can't be totally sure you're for Sunshine, so I order you to let me shoot you." "Hold on," said Parvati. "We're only ahead of Chaos by 1 point. If you shoot me now, I'll shoot you in the name of Dragon, obviously," said Zabini, now sounding a little superior. "Just because we tricked them into doing it doesn't mean it won't work for us." Parvati stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "General Malfoy said your mother doesn't like Hermione." "I suppose," said Zabini, still with that superior smirk. "But some of us are more willing than Draco Malfoy to annoy a parent. And Harry Potter said you have a cousin." "Nope," said Zabini. Parvati stared at him, trying to think, but she wasn't really good at plotting. Zabinid said the plan was to secretly keep the scores of Chaos and Dragon as even as possible so they'd use Sunshine's name to execute their traitors instead of losing even a single point, and that had worked. But she had the feeling she was missing something. She wasn't a Slytherin. "Why don't I shoot you in the name of dragon?" said Parvati. "Because I outrank you," said Zabini. Parvati had a bad feeling about this. She stared at him for a long moment. And then, "Samni," she started to say, and then realized she hadn't said for dragon and frantically cut herself off Granger. 255/Malfoy, 254/Potter, 254, "Hey, everyone," said Blaise, Zabini's face on the screens looking quite amused. "Guess it's all down to me." All by the lakeside, people were holding their breath. Sunshine was ahead of Dragon and Chaos by exactly 1 point. Blaise Zabini could shoot himself in the name of either Dragon or Chaos, or just leave things the way they were. A series of chimes indicated that the last minute of time was running out, and the Slytherin was smiling a strange, twisted smile, and casually toying with his wand, the dark wood barely visible in the dark water. "You know," said Blaise Zabini's voice, in the tones of someone who'd been rehearsing the words for a while, "it's just a game, really, and games are supposed to be fun. So how about if I just do whatever I feel like?" 34. Coordination Problems, PT2. Minerva and Dumbledore together had applied their combined talent to conjure the grand stage toward which Quirrell now slowly trudged. It was, at its core, sturdy wood, but the outer surfaces shone with glitter of marble, inlaid with platinum, and studded with gems of every house color. Neither she nor the headmaster was any founder of Hogwarts, but the conjuration only needed to last a few hours. Minerva ordinarily enjoyed the few occasions when she had the occasion to tire herself out on large transfigurations. She should have enjoyed the many small chances for artistry and the illusion of opulence. But this time, she had done the work with the dreadful feeling of digging her own grave. But Minerva was feeling a little better now. Had been one brief moment when the explosion might have come, but Dumbledore had already been standing up and applauding warmly, and no one had proven foolish enough to riot in front of the headmaster, and the explosive mood had rapidly faded into a collective sentiment which might perhaps have been described by the phrase, "Give us a break." Blaise Zabini had shot himself in the name of sunshine, and the final score had been 254 to 254 to 254. Behind the stage, waiting to ascend, 3 children were glaring at each other in mingled fury and frustration. It didn't help that they were still damp from being fished out of the lake, and that the warming charms didn't seem quite enough to make up for the crisp December air, or maybe it was just their mood. "That's it," said Granger. "I've had it. No more traitors." "I completely agree with you, Miss Granger," Draco said icily. "Enough is enough. And what do you two intend to do about it?" Snapped Harry Potter. "Professor Quirrell already said he wouldn't ban spies." "We'll ban them for him," said Draco grimly. He hadn't even understood what he meant by the words as he said them, but the very act of speaking seemed to crystallize a plan. The stage really was well done, at least for a temporary structure. The makers hadn't fallen into the usual pitfall of being impressed by their own illusion of wealth and knew something about architecture and visual style. From where Draco stood, in the obvious place for him to stand, the watching students would see him haloed in the faint glitter of emeralds, and Granger, standing where Draco had subtly motioned her, would be haloed in Ravenclaw's sapphire. As for Harry Potter, Draco wasn't looking at him right now. Professor Quirrell had awakened, or whatever it was he did, and was leaning upon a platinum podium bare of all gems. With evident showmanship, the defense professor was carefully stacking and squaring those 3 envelopes containing the 3 parchments upon which the 3 generals had written their wishes, as all the students of Hogwarts watched and waited. Finally, Professor Quirrell looked up from the envelopes. "Well," said the defense professor, "this is inconvenient." A slight titter of laughter ran through the crowd, with a sharp undertone. "I suppose you are all wondering what I will do," said Professor Quirrell. "There is nothing for it. I shall have to do what is fair. Although first there was a little speech I wanted to make, and before even that, it appears to me that Mr. Malfoy and Miss Granger have something they wish to share." Draco blinked, and then he and Granger traded rapid glances. "May I?" "Yes, go ahead," and Draco raised his voice. "General Granger and I would both like to say," Draco said in his most formal voice, knowing it was being amplified and heard, "that we will no longer accept the help of any traitors. And if, in any battle, we find that Potter has accepted traitors from either of our armies, we will join forces to crush him." And Draco shot a glance filled at malice at the boy who lived. "Take that, General Chaos." "I agree completely with General Malfoy," said Granger, standing beside him, her high voice clear and strong. "Neither of us will use traitors, and if General Potter does, we will wipe him off the battlefield." There was a susurration of surprise from the watching students. "Very good," said their defense professor, smiling. "It took the two of you long enough, but you are still to be congratulated on having thought of it before any other generals." It took a moment for this to soak in. "In the future, Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, before you come to my office with any request, consider whether there is a way for you to accomplish it without my help. I will not deduct Quirrell points on this occasion, but next time you may expect to lose the full 50. Professor Quirrell wore an amused grin. "And what do you have to say about that, Mr. Potter?" Harry Potter's gaze went to Granger, then to Draco. His face appeared calm, though Draco was sure controlled would have been the better term. Finally, Harry Potter spoke, his voice level. "The Chaos Legion is still happy to accept traitors. See you on the battlefield." Draco knew the shock was showing on his own face. There were astonished murmurs from the watching students, and when Draco glanced at the front row, he saw that even Harry's chaotics looked taken aback. Granger's face was angry, and getting angrier. "Mr. Potter," she said in a sharp tone like she thought she was a teacher, "are you trying to be obnoxious?" "Most certainly not," Harry Potter said calmly. "I won't make you do it every time. Beat me once and I'll stay beaten. But threats aren't always enough, General of Sunshine. You did not ask me to join with you, but tried simply to impose your will. And sometimes you must actually defeat the enemy to impose your will on him. You see, I am skeptical that Hermione Granger, the brightest academic star of Hogwarts, and Draco, son of Lucius, scion of the noble and most ancient house of Malfoy, can work together to beat their common foe, Harry Potter." An amused smile crossed Harry Potter's face. "Maybe I'll just do what Draco tried with Zabini and write a letter to Lucius Malfoy and see what he thinks about that." "Harry," gasped Granger, looking absolutely aghast, and there were gasps from the audience as well. Draco controlled the anger flushing through him. That had been a stupid move on Harry's part, saying that in public. If Harry had simply done it, it might have worked. Draco hadn't even thought about that. But now if father did that, it would look like he was playing into Harry's hands. "If you think my father, Lord Malfoy, can be manipulated by you that easily," Draco said coldly, "you have a surprise coming, Harry Potter." And Draco realized, as the words finished leaving his mouth, that he just backed his own father squarely into the corner, more or less without even meaning to. Father probably wasn't going to like this, not the tiniest bit, but now it would be impossible for him to say so. Draco would have to apologize for that. It had been an honest accident, but it was strange to think that he'd done it at all. "Then go ahead and defeat the evil General Chaos," Harry said, still looking amused. "I can't win against both your armies, not if you really work together, but I wonder if perhaps I could break you up before then." "You won't, and we'll crush you," said Draco Malfoy, and beside him, Hermione Granger firmly nodded. "Well," said Professor Quirrell, after the astounded silence had stretched for a while, "that was not how I expected that particular conversation to go." The defense professor had a rather intrigued expression on his face. "Truthfully, Mr. Potter, I expected you to concede immediately and with a smile, then announce that you had long since worked out my intended lesson, but had decided not to spoil it for others. Indeed, I planned my speech accordingly, Mr. Potter." Harry Potter just shrugged. "Sorry about that," he said, and said nothing more. "Oh, don't worry," said Professor Quirrell. "This, too, will serve." And Professor Quirrell turned from the three children and straightened at the podium to address the whole watching crowd. His customary air of detached amusement dropped away like a falling mask, and when he spoke again, his voice was amplified louder than it had been. "If not for Harry Potter," said Professor Quirrell, his voice as crisp and cold as December, "you know who would have won." The silence was instant and total. "Make no mistake," said Professor Quirrell. "The Dark Lord was winning." There were fewer and fewer Aurors who dared face him. The vigilantes who opposed him were being hunted down. One Dark Lord and perhaps 50 Death Eaters were winning against a country of thousands. That is beyond ridiculous. There are no grades low enough for me to mark that incompetence. There was a frown on the face of Headmaster Dumbledore, and on the faces of the audience, puzzlement and the utter silence went on. Do you understand now how it happened? You saw it today. I allowed traitors and gave the generals no means to restrain them. You saw the result. Clever plots and clever betrayals, until the last soldier left on the battlefield shot himself. You cannot possibly doubt that all three of those armies could have been defeated by any outside foe that was unified within itself. Professor Quirrell leaned forward at the podium, his voice now filled with a grim intensity. His right hand stretched out, fingers open and spread. Division is weakness, said the defense professor. His hand closed into a tight fist. Unity is strength. The Dark Lord understood that well, whatever his other follies, and he used that understanding to create the one simple invention that made him the most terrible Dark Lord in history. Your parents faced one Dark Lord, and 50 Death Eaters who were perfectly unified, knowing that any breach of their loyalty would be punished by death, that any slack or incompetence would be punished by pain. None could escape the Dark Lord's grasp once they took his mark, and the Death Eaters agreed to take that terrible mark because they knew that once they took it, they would be united, facing a divided land. One Dark Lord and 50 Death Eaters would have defeated an entire country by the power of the Dark Mark. Professor Quirrell's voice was bleak and hard. Your parents could have fought back in kind. They did not. There was a man named Yermy Wibble who called upon the nation to institute a draft, though he did not quite have vision enough to propose a Mark of Britain. Yermy Wibble knew what would happen to him. He hoped his death would inspire others. So the Dark Lord took his family for good measure. Their empty skins inspired nothing but fear, and no one dared to speak again. And your parents would have faced the consequences of their despicable cowardice, if not for being saved by a 1-year-old boy. Professor Quirrell's face showed full contempt. A dramatist would have called that a Deus ex machina, for they did nothing to earn their salvation. He who must not be named may not have deserved to win, but make no doubt of it, your parents deserved to lose. The voice of the defense professor rang forth like iron. And know this, your parents have learned nothing. The nation is still fragmented and weak. How few decades passed between Grindelwald and you-know-who. Do you think you will not see the next threat in your own lifetimes? Will you repeat then the follies of your parents when you have seen the results so clearly laid out before you this day? For I can tell you what your parents will do when the day of darkness comes. I can tell you what lesson they have learned. They have learned to hide like cowards and do nothing while they wait for Harry Potter to save them. There was a wondering look in the eyes of Headmaster Dumbledore, and other students gazed up at their defense professor with bewilderment and anger and awe. Professor Quirrell's eyes were as cold now as his voice. Mark this, and mark it well. He who must not be named wished to rule over this country, to hold it in his cruel grasp forever. But at least he wished to rule over a living country, and not a heap of ash. There have been Dark Lords who were mad, who wished only to make the world a vast funeral pyre. There have been wars in which one whole country marched against another. Your parents nearly lost against 100 who thought to take this country alive. How quickly would they have been crushed by a foe more numerous than they, a foe that cared for nothing but their destruction. This I foretell. When the next threat rises, Lucius Malfoy will claim that you must follow him or perish, that your only hope is to trust in his cruelty and strength. And though Lucius Malfoy himself will believe it, this will be a lie. For when the Dark Lord perished, Lucius Malfoy did not unite the Death Eaters. They were shattered in an instant. They fled like whipped dogs and betrayed each other. Lucius Malfoy is not strong enough to be a true lord, dark or otherwise. Draco Malfoy's fists were clenched white. There were tears in his eyes, and fury and unbearable shame. No, said Professor Quirrell, I do not think it will be Lucius Malfoy who saves you. Unless you think that I speak on my own behalf, time will make clear soon enough that this is not so. I make you no recommendation, my students. But I say that if a whole country were to find a leader as strong as the Dark Lord, but honorable and pure, and take his mark, then they could crush any Dark Lord like an insect, and all the rest of our divided magical world could not threaten them. And if some still greater enemy rose against us in a war of extermination, then only a united magical world could survive. There were gasps, mostly from Muggle-borns. The students in green-trimmed robes looked merely puzzled. Now it was Harry Potter whose fists were clenched tight and trembling, and Hermione Granger beside him was angry and dismayed. The headmaster rose from his seat, his face now stern, saying no word as yet, but the command was clear. "I do not say what threat will come," said Professor Quirrell, "but you will not live all your lives in peace, not if the past history of the world is any guide at all to its future. And if you do in the future as you have seen 3 armies do this day, if you cannot throw aside your petty bickering and take the mark of a single leader, then indeed you might wish that the Dark Lord had lived to rule over you, and regret the day that ever Harry Potter was born." "Enough!" bellowed Albus Dumbledore. There was silence. Professor Quirrell slowly turned his head to gaze at where Albus Dumbledore stood in the fury of his wizardry. Their eyes met, and a soundless stress pressed down like weight upon all the students as they listened, not daring to move. "You, too, failed this country," said Professor Quirrell. "And you know the peril as well as I. Such speeches are not for the ears of students," said Albus Dumbledore in a dangerously rising voice, "nor for the mouths of professors." Dryly then, Professor Quirrell spoke. There were many speeches made for the ears of adults as the Dark Lord rose, and the adults clapped and cheered and went home having enjoyed their day's entertainment. But I will obey you, headmaster, and make no further speeches if you do not like them. My lesson is simple. I will go on doing nothing about traitors, and we will see what students can do for themselves about that when they do not wait for professors to save them. And then Professor Quirrell turned back to his students, and his mouth quirked up in a wry grin that seemed to dissipate the dreadful pressure like a guard blowing to scatter the clouds. "But do please be kind to the traitors up until now," said Professor Quirrell. "They were just having fun." There was laughter, though it was nervous at first, and then it seemed to build as Professor Quirrell stood there smiling wryly, and some of the tension released itself. Draco's mind was still whirling through 1,000 questions and a daze of horror, as Professor Quirrell prepared to open the envelopes in which the 3 had inscribed their wishes. It had never before occurred to Draco that moon-traveling muggles were a greater threat than the slow decline of wizardry, or that Father had proven himself too weak to stop them. And even stranger, the obvious implication. Professor Quirrell believed that Harry could. The defense professor claimed to have made no recommendation, but he'd mentioned Harry Potter over and over in his speech. Others would already be thinking the same thing as Draco. It was ridiculous. The boy who had covered a stuffed chair in glitter and called it a throne, the boy who faced down Snape and won, whispered a traitorous voice. That boy could grow into a lord strong enough to rule, strong enough to save us all. Harry had been raised by muggles. He was practically a mudblood himself. He wouldn't fight against his adopted family. He knows their arts, their secrets, and their methods. He can take all of the muggles' science and use it against them, alongside our own power as wizards. But what if he refuses? What if he's too weak? Then, said that inner voice, "It will have to be you, won't it, Draco Malfoy?" And then there was a renewed hush from the crowd as Professor Quirrell opened the first envelope. "Malfoy," said Professor Quirrell, "your wish is for Slytherin to win the House Cup." There was a puzzled pause from the watching audience. "Yes, Professor," said Draco in a clear voice, knowing that it was once again being amplified. "If you can't do that, then something else for Slytherin. I will not award house points unfairly," said Professor Quirrell. He tapped a cheek, looking thoughtful. "Which makes your wish difficult enough to be interesting. Would you like to say anything about why, Mr. Malfoy?" Draco turned from the defense professor, gazed out at the crowd from against that backdrop of platinum and emeralds. Not all of Slytherin had cheered for Dragon Army. There were anti-Malfoy factions who had expressed that dissatisfaction by supporting the boy who lived, or even Granger, and those factions would be encouraged greatly by what Zabini had done. He needed to remind them that Slytherin meant Malfoy and Malfoy meant Slytherin. "No," said Draco. "They're Slytherins. They'll understand." There was some laughter from the audience, especially in Slytherin, even from some students who would have called themselves anti-Malfoy a moment earlier. Flattery was a lovely thing. Draco turned back to look at Professor Quirrell again and was surprised to see an embarrassed look on Granger's face. "And for Miss Granger," said Professor Quirrell, there was the sound of a tearing envelope. "Your wish is for Ravenclaw to win the House Cup." Was considerable laughter from the audience, including a chuckle from Draco. He hadn't thought Granger played that game. "Well, said Granger, sounding like she was suddenly stumbling over a memorized speech. "I meant to say that." She took a deep breath. There were soldiers from every house in my army, and I don't mean to slight any of them, but houses should still count for something, too. It was sad when students in the same house were hexing each other just because they were in different armies. People should be able to rely on whoever's in their house. That's why Godric Gryffindor and Salazar Slytherin and Rowena Ravenclaw and Helga Hufflepuff created the 4 houses of Hogwarts in the first place. I'm the General of Sunshine, but even before that, I'm Hermione Granger of Ravenclaw, and I'm proud to be part of a house that's 800 years old. Well said, Miss Granger, said Dumbledore's booming voice. Harry Potter was frowning, and something tickled at the edge of Draco's recognition. An interesting sentiment, Miss Granger, said Professor Quirrell. But there are times when it is good for a Slytherin to have friends in Ravenclaw, or for a Gryffindor to have friends in Hufflepuff. Surely it would be best if you could rely both on your friends in your house and also your friends in your army. Granger's eyes flicked briefly toward the watching students and teachers, and she said nothing. Professor Quirrell nodded as though to himself, and then turned back to the podium and took up and tore open the last envelope. Beside Draco, Harry Potter visibly tensed up as the defense professor drew forth the parchment. And Mr. Potter wishes for, there was a pause as Professor Quirrell looked at the parchment. Then, without any change of expression on Professor Quirrell's face, the sheet of parchment burst into flames and burned with a brief, intense fire that left only drifting black dust sprinkling down from his hand. Please confine yourself to the possible, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, sounding very dry indeed. There was a long pause. Harry, standing beside Draco, looked rather shaken. What in Merlin's name did he ask for? I do hope, said Professor Quirrell, that you prepared another wish if I could not grant that one. There was another pause. Harry drew a deep breath. I didn't, he said, but I already thought of another one. Harry Potter turned to look out at the audience, and his voice firmed as he spoke. People fear traitors because of the damage the traitor does directly, the soldiers they shoot, or the secrets they tell. But that's only part of the danger. What people do because they're afraid of traitors also costs them. I used that strategy today against Sunshine and Dragon. I didn't tell my traitors to cause as much direct damage as possible. I told them to act in the way that would create the most distrust and confusion and make the generals do the most costly things to try and stop them from doing it again. When there are just a few traitors and a whole country opposing them, it stands to reason that what a few traitors do might be less damaging than what a whole country does to stop them, that the cure might be worse than the disease. Mr. Potter, said the defense professor, his voice suddenly cutting, the lesson of history is that you are simply wrong. Your parents' generation did too little to unify themselves, not too much. This whole country almost fell, Mr. Potter, though you were not there to see it. I suggest that you ask your dorm mates in Ravenclaw how many of them have lost family to the Dark Lord, or if you are wiser, do not ask. Do you have a wish to make, Mr. Potter? If you don't mind, said the mild voice of Albus Dumbledore, I should like to hear what the boy who lived has to say. He has more experience than either of us at stopping wars. A few people laughed, but not many. Harry Potter's gaze moved to Dumbledore, and he looked considering for a moment. I'm not saying you're wrong, Professor Quirrell. In the last war, people didn't act together, and a whole country almost fell to a few dozen attackers, and yes, that was pathetic. And if we make the same mistake next time, yes, that'll be even more pathetic. But you never fight the same war twice. And the problem is, the enemy is also allowed to be smart. If you're divided, you're vulnerable in one way. But when you try to unite, then you face other risks and other costs, and the enemy will try to take advantage of those, too. You can't stop thinking at just one level of the game. Simplicity also has a great deal to commend it, Mr. Potter, said the dry voice of the defense professor. I do hope that you have learned something this day about the dangers of strategies more complicated than uniting your people and attacking your enemy. And if all this does not tie into your wish somehow, I shall be quite annoyed. Yes, said Harry Potter. It was pretty difficult coming up with a wish to symbolize the costs of unity. But the problem of acting together isn't just for wars. It's something we have to solve all our lives, every day. If everyone is coordinating using the same rules, and the rules are stupid, then if one person decides to do things differently, they're breaking the rules. if everyone decides to do things differently, they can. It's exactly the same problem of everyone needing to act together. But for the first person who speaks out, it seems like they're going against the crowd. And if you thought that the only important thing was that people should always be unified, then you could never change the game, no matter how stupid the rules. So my own wish, to symbolize what happens when people unite in the wrong direction, is that in Hogwarts we should play Quidditch without the snitch. What? Screamed 100 voices in the crowd, as Draco's jaw dropped. The snitch ruins the whole game, said Harry Potter. Everything the other players do ends up being irrelevant. It would make overwhelmingly more sense to just buy a clock. It's one of those incredibly stupid things you don't notice just because you grew up with it, that people only do because everyone else is doing it. But by that point, Harry Potter's voice could no longer be heard, because the riot had started. The riot ended around 15 seconds later, after a gigantic spout of fire blasted out of the highest tower of Hogwarts to the sound of 100 thunders. Draco hadn't known Dumbledore could do that. The students sat down again very carefully and quietly. Professor Quirrell was laughing without pause. So be it, Mr. Potter. Your will be done. The defense professor paused deliberately. Of course, I only promised one cunning plot, and that is all that the three of you will get. Draco had been half expecting the words earlier, but now they still came as a shock. Draco exchanged rapid glances with Granger. They would have been the obvious allies, but their wishes were directly opposed. You mean, said Harry, we have to all agree on a wish. Oh, that would be far too much to ask, said Professor Quirrell. The three of you have no common enemy, do you? And for one brief moment, so fast that Draco thought he might have imagined it, the defense professor's eyes flicked in the direction of Dumbledore. No, said Professor Quirrell, I mean that I shall grant 3 wishes using a single plot. There was a confused silence. You can't do that, Harry said flatly from beside Draco. Not even I can do that. 2 of those wishes are mutually incompatible. It's logically impossible. And then Harry cut himself off. You're a few years too young to tell me what I can't do, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, with a brief dry smile. Then the defense professor turned back to the watching students. Truthfully, I have no confidence in your ability to learn this day's lesson. Go home and enjoy your time with your families, or what's left of them, while they still live. My own family is long since dead at the Dark Lord's hand. I shall see you all when classes resume. In the speechless silence that resulted, Professor Quirrell already turning to walk off the stage, Draco heard the defense professor's voice say, quietly and no longer amplified, "But you, Mr. Potter, I would speak to now." 35. Coordination Problems, PT3. They had gone to the defense professor's office, and Professor Quirrell had sealed the door before he leaned back in his chair and spoke. The defense professor's voice was very calm, and that unnerved Harry a good deal more than if Professor Quirrell had been shouting. I am trying, said Professor Quirrell quietly, to make allowances for the fact that you are young, that I myself, at the same age, was a quite extraordinary fool. You speak with adult style and meddle in adult games, and sometimes I forget that you are only a meddler. I hope, Mr. Potter, that your childish meddling has not just killed you, ruined your country, and lost the next war. It was very hard for Harry to control his breathing. Professor Quirrell, I said a good deal less than I wished to say, but I had to say something. Your proposals are extremely alarming to anyone who has the slightest familiarity with Muggle history over the last century. The Italian fascists, some very nasty people, got their name from the fasces, a bundle of rods bound together to symbolize the idea that unity is strength. So the nasty Italian fascists believed that unity is stronger than division, said Professor Quirrell. Sharpness was beginning to creep into his voice. Perhaps they also believed that the sky is blue and advocated a policy of not dropping rocks on your head. Reverse stupidity is not intelligence. The world's stupidest person may say the sun is shining, but that doesn't make it dark out. Fine, you're right. That was an ad hominem argument. It's not wrong because the fascists said it. But Professor Quirrell, you can't have everyone in a country take the mark of one dictator. It's a single point of failure. Look, I'll put it this way. Suppose the enemy just imperiuses whoever controls the mark. Powerful wizards are not so easy to imperius, said Professor Quirrell dryly. And if you cannot find a worthy leader, you are in any case doomed. But worthy leaders do exist. The question is whether the people shall follow them. Harry raked his hands through his hair in frustration. He wanted to call a timeout and make Professor Quirrell read the rise and fall of the Third Reich and then start the conversation over again. I don't suppose that if I suggested democracy was a better form of government than dictatorship. I see, said Professor Quirrell. His eyes closed briefly, then opened. Mr. Potter, the stupidity of Quidditch is transparent to you because you did not grow up revering the game. If you had never heard of elections, Mr. Potter, and you simply saw what is there, what you saw would not please you. Look to our elected Minister of Magic. Is he the wisest, the strongest, the greatest of our nation? No, he is a buffoon who is owned in fee simple by Lucius Malfoy. Wizards went to the polls and chose between Cornelius Fudge and Tania Leach, who had competed with each other in a grand and entertaining contest after the Daily Prophet, which Lucius Malfoy also controls, decided that they were the only serious candidates. That Cornelius Fudge was genuinely selected as the best leader our country could offer is not a suggestion anyone could make with a straight face. It is no different in the Muggle world, from what I have heard and seen. The last Muggle newspaper I read mentioned that the previous president of the United States had been a retired movie actor. If you had not grown up with elections, Mr. Potter, they would be as transparently silly to you as Quidditch. Harry sat there with his mouth open, struggling for words. The point of elections isn't to produce the one best leader. It's to keep politicians scared enough of the voters that they don't go completely evil like dictators do. The last war, Mr. Potter, was fought between the Dark Lord and Dumbledore. And while Dumbledore was a flawed leader who was losing the war, it is ridiculous to suggest that any of the ministers of magic elected during that period could have taken Dumbledore's place. Strength flows from powerful wizards and their followers, not from elections and the fools they elect. That is the lesson of magical Britain's recent history, and I doubt that the next war will teach you a lesson any different. If you survive it, Mr. Potter, which you will not do unless you abandon the enthusiastic illusions of childhood. If you think there are no dangers in the course of action you advocate, said Harry, and despite everything his voice was growing sharp, then that too is childish enthusiasm. Harry stared grimly into Professor Quirrell's eyes, who stared back without blinking. Such dangers, said Professor Quirrell coldly, are to be discussed in offices like this one, not in speeches. The fools who elected Cornelius Fudge are not interested in complications and caution. Present them with anything more nuanced than a rousing cheer, and you will face your war alone. That, Mr. Potter, was your childish error, which Draco Malfoy would not have made even when he was 8 years old. It should have been obvious even to you that you should have stayed silent and consulted with me first, not spoken your worries before the crowd. I am no friend of Albus Dumbledore, said Harry, a cold in his voice to match Professor Quirrell's. But he is no child, and he did not seem to think my concerns were childish, nor that I should have waited to speak them. Oh, said Professor Quirrell, so you take your cues from the headmaster now, do you? And stood up from behind his desk. When Blaise turned the corner on the way to the office, he saw that Professor Quirrell was already leaning against the wall. Blaise Zabini, said the defense professor, straightening. His eyes were set like dark stones within his face, and his voice sent a shiver of fear down Blaise's spine. He can't do anything against me. I just have to remember that. I believe, said Professor Quirrell in a clear, cold voice, that I have already guessed the name of your employer. But I would hear it from your own lips, and tell me also the price that bought you. Blaise knew he was sweating under his robes, and that the moisture would be already visible on his forehead. I got a chance to show I was better than all 3 generals, and I took it. A lot of people hate me now, but there are also plenty of Slytherins who'll love me for it. What makes you think I'm? You did not devise the plan of today's battle, Mr. Zabini. Tell me who did. Blaise swallowed hard. Well, I mean, in that case, then you already know who did right. The only one who's that crazy is Dumbledore, and he'll protect me if you try to do anything. Indeed, tell me the price. The defense professor's eyes were still hard. It's my cousin, Kimberly, Blaise said, swallowing again and trying to control his voice. She's real, and she's really being bullied. Potter checked that. He wasn't dumb. Only Dumbledore said that he'd nudged the bullies into doing it, just for the plan, and if I worked for him she'd be fine afterward, but if I did go with Potter, there was more trouble Kimberly could get into. Professor Quirrell was silent for a long moment. I see, Professor Quirrell said, his voice now much milder. Mr. Zabini, should such an event occur again, you may contact me directly. I have my own ways of protecting my friends. Now a final question. Even with all the power you took into your hands, forcing a tie would have been difficult. Did Dumbledore instruct you as to who should win otherwise? Sunshine, said Blaise. Professor Quirrell nodded. As I thought. The defense professor sighed. In your future career, Mr. Zabini, I do not suggest trying any plots that complicated. They have a tendency to fail. I said that to the headmaster, actually, Blaise said, and he said that was why it was important to have more than one plot going at a time. Professor Quirrell passed a weary hand across his forehead. It's a wonder the Dark Lord didn't go mad from fighting him. You may go on to your meeting with the headmaster, Mr. Zabini. I will say nothing of this, but if the headmaster should somehow discover that we have spoken, remember my standing offer to give you what protection I can. You are dismissed. Blaise didn't wait for any other word, just turned and fled. Professor Quirrell waited for a time and then said, Go ahead, Mr. Potter. Harry tore the cloak of invisibility off his head and stuffed into his pouch. He was trembling with so much rage he could hardly speak. He what? He did what? You should have deduced it yourself, Mr. Potter, Professor Quirrell said mildly. You must learn to blur your vision until you can see the forest obscured by the trees. Anyone who heard the stories about you, and who did not know that you were the mysterious boy who lived, could easily deduce your ownership of an invisibility cloak. Step back from these events, blur away their details, and what do we observe? There was a great rivalry between students, and their competition ended in a perfect tie. That sort of thing only happens in stories, Mr. Potter, and there is one person in this school who thinks in stories. There was a strange and complicated plot, which you should have realized was uncharacteristic of the young Slytherin you faced. But there is a person in this school who deals in plots that elaborate, and his name is not Zabini. And I did warn you that there was a quadruple agent. You knew that Zabini was at least a triple agent, and you should have guessed a high chance that it was he. No, I will not declare the battle invalid. All three of you failed the test and lost to your common enemy. Harry didn't care about tests at this point. Dumbledore blackmailed Zabini by threatening his cousin, just to make our battle end in a tie. Why? Professor Quirrell gave a mirthless laugh. Perhaps the headmaster thought the rivalry was good for his pet hero and wished to see it continue. For the greater good, you understand. Or perhaps he was simply mad. You see, Mr. Potter, everyone knows that Dumbledore's madness is a mask, that he is sane pretending to be insane. They pride themselves on that clever insight, and knowing the secret explanation, they stop looking. It does not occur to them that it is also possible to have a mask behind the mask, to be insane pretending to be sane, pretending to be insane. And I am afraid, Mr. Potter, that I have urgent business elsewhere, and must depart. But I should strongly advise you not to take your cues from Albus Dumbledore when fighting a war. Until later, Mr. Potter. And the defense professor inclined his head with some irony, and then strode off in the same direction Zabini had fled, while Harry was still standing in open-mouthed shock. Aftermath, Harry Potter. Harry trudged slowly toward the Ravenclaw dorm, eyes unseeing of walls, paintings, or other students. He went upstairs and down ramps without slowing, speeding, or noticing where he trod. It had taken him more than a minute after Professor Quirrell's departure to realize that his only source of information about Dumbledore being involved was a Blaise Zabini, who he would have to be an absolute gaping idiot to trust again, and B, Professor Quirrell, who could have easily faked a plot in Dumbledore's style, and who might also think that a little student rivalry was a fine thing, and who had, if you stepped back and blurred out the details, just proposed turning the country into a magical dictatorship. And it was also possible that Dumbledore was the one behind Zabini, and that Professor Quirrell had been sincerely trying to fight the Dark Mark in kind, and prevent the repetition of a performance he saw as pathetic. Trying to make sure that Harry didn't end up fighting the Dark Lord alone, while everyone else hid, frightened, trying to stay out of the line of fire, waiting for Harry to save them. But the truth was, well, Harry was sort of okay with that. It was, he knew, the kind of thing that was supposed to make heroes resentful and bitter. To heck with that. Harry was very much in favor of everyone else staying out of danger, while the boy who lived took down the Dark Lord by himself, plus or minus a small number of companions. If the next conflict with the Dark Lord got to the point of a second wizarding war that killed lots of people and embroiled a whole country, that would mean Harry had already failed. And if afterward a war broke out between wizards and muggles, it didn't matter who won. Harry would have already failed by letting it get that far. Besides, who said the societies couldn't peacefully integrate when the secrecy inevitably broke down? Though Harry could hear Professor Quirrell's dry voice in his mind, asking him if he was a fool and saying all the obvious things. And if mages and muggles couldn't live in peace, then Harry would combine magic and science and figure out how to evacuate all the wizards to Mars or somewhere, instead of letting a war break out. Because if it did come down to a war of extermination, that was the thing Professor Quirrell hadn't realized, the one most important question he'd forgotten to ask his young general. The real reason why Harry had no intention of being argued into endorsing a light mark, no matter how much it would help him in his fight against the Dark Lord. One Dark Lord and 50 marked followers had been a peril to all of magical Britain. If all Britain took the mark of a strong leader, they would be a peril to the whole magical world. And if the whole wizarding world took a single mark, they would be a danger to the rest of humanity. No one knew quite how many wizards there were in the world. He'd done a few estimates with Hermione and come up with numbers in the rough range of 1 million. But there were 6 billion muggles, if it came down to a final war. Professor Quirrell had forgotten to ask Harry which side he would protect. A scientific civilization, reaching outward, looking upward, knowing that its destiny was to grasp the stars. And a magical civilization, slowly fading as knowledge was lost, still governed by a nobility that saw muggles as not quite human. It was a terribly sad feeling, but not one that held any hint of doubt. Aftermath, Blaise Zabini. Blaise strolled through the hallways with careful, self-imposed slowness, his heart beating wildly as he tried to calm down. "Ahem," said a dry, whispering voice from a shadowy alcove as he passed. Blaise jumped, but he didn't scream. Slowly, he turned. In that small, shadowy corner was a black cloak, so wide and billowing that it was impossible to determine whether the figure beneath was male or female, and atop the cloak, a broad-brimmed black hat, and a black mist seemed to gather beneath it and obscure the face of whoever or whatever might lie beneath. "Report," whispered Mr. Hat and Cloak. "I said just what you told me to," said Blaise. His voice was a little calmer now that he wasn't lying to anyone. And Professor Quirrell reacted just the way you expected. The broad black hat tilted and straightened, as though the head below had nodded. "Excellent," said the unidentifiable whisper. "The reward I promised you is already on its way to your mother, by owl." Blaise hesitated, but his curiosity was eating him alive. "Can I ask now why you want to cause trouble between Professor Quirrell and Dumbledore?" The headmaster hadn't had anything to do with the Gryffindor bullies that Blaise knew about, and besides helping Kimberly, the headmaster had also offered to make Professor Binns give him excellent marks in history of magic, even if he turned in blank parchments for his homework, though he'd still have to attend class and pretend to hand them in. Actually, Blaise would have betrayed all 3 generals for free, and never mind his cousin either, but he'd seen no need to say that. The broad black hat cocked to one side, as if to convey a quizzical stare. "Tell me, friend Blaise, did it occur to you that traitors who betray so many times over often meet with ill ends?" "Nope," said Blaise, looking straight into the black mist under the hat. "Everyone knows that nothing really bad ever happens to students in Hogwarts." Mr. Hat and Cloak gave a whispery chuckle. "Indeed," said the whisper. "With the murder of one student 5 decades ago being the exception that proves the rule, since Salazar Slytherin would have keyed his monster into the ancient wards at a higher level than the headmaster himself." Blaise stared at the black mist, now beginning to feel a little uneasy. But it ought to take a Hogwarts professor to do anything significant to him without setting off alarms. Quirrell and Snape were the only professors who'd do something like this, and Quirrell wouldn't care about fooling himself, and Snape wouldn't hurt one of his own Slytherins. Would he? "No, friend Blaise," whispered the black mist. "I only wish to advise you never to try anything like this in your adult life. So many betrayals would certainly lead to at least one vengeance. My mother never got any vengeances, said Blaise proudly. Even though she married 7 husbands, and every single one of them died mysteriously and left her lots of money. Really, said the Whisper. However did she persuade the 7th to marry her after he heard what happened to the first 6? I asked Mum that, said Blaise, and she said I couldn't know until I was old enough, and I asked her how old was old enough, and she said older than her. Again the whispery chuckle. Well then, friend Blaise, my congratulations on having followed in your mother's footsteps. Go, and if you say nothing of this, we will not meet again. Blaise backed uneasily away, feeling an odd reluctance to turn his back. The hat tilted. Oh, come now, little Slytherin. If you were truly the equal of Harry Potter or Draco Malfoy, you would have already realized that my hinted threats were just to ensure your silence before Albus. Had I intended to harm, I would not have hinted. Had I said nothing, then you should have worried. Blaise straightened, feeling a little insulted, and nodded to Mr. Hat and Cloak, then turned decisively and strode off toward his meeting with the headmaster. He'd been hoping to the very end that someone else would show up and give him a chance to sell out Mr. Hat and Cloak. But then Mum hadn't betrayed 7 different husbands at the same time. When you looked at it that way, he was still doing better than her. And Blaise Zabini went on walking toward the headmaster's office, smiling, content to be a quintuple agent. For a moment the boy stumbled, but then straightened, shaking off the odd feeling of disorientation. And Blaise Zabini went on walking toward the headmaster's office, smiling, content to be a quadruple agent. Aftermath, Hermione Granger. The messenger didn't approach her until she was alone. Hermione was just leaving the girls' bathroom where she sometimes hid to think, and a bright shining cat leaped out of nowhere and said, "Miss Granger." She let out a little shriek before she realized the cat had spoken in Professor McGonagall's voice. Even so, she hadn't been frightened, only startled. The cat was bright and brilliant and beautiful, glowing with a white-silver radiance like moon-colored sunlight, and she couldn't imagine being scared. "What are you?" said Hermione. "This is a message from Professor McGonagall," said the cat, still in the professor's voice. "Can you come to my office and not speak of this to anyone?" "I'll be there right away," said Hermione, still surprised, and the cat leaped and vanished. Only it didn't vanish, it traveled away somehow. Or that was what her mind said, even though her eyes just saw it disappear. By the time Hermione had got to the office of her favorite professor, her mind was all awhirl with speculations. Was there something wrong with her transfiguration scores? But then why would Professor McGonagall say not to tell anyone? It was probably about Harry practicing his partial transfiguration. Professor McGonagall's face looked worried, not stern, as Hermione seated herself in front of the desk, trying to keep her eyes from going to the nest of cubbyholes containing Professor McGonagall's homework. She'd always wondered what sort of work grown-ups had to do to keep the school running, and whether they could use any help from her. "Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall, "let me start by saying that I already know about the headmaster asking you to make that wish. He told you," blurted Hermione in startlement. The headmaster had said no one else was supposed to know. Professor McGonagall paused, looked at Hermione, and gave a sad little chuckle. "It's good to see Mr. Potter hasn't corrupted you too much. Miss Granger, you aren't supposed to admit anything just because I say I know. As it happens, the headmaster did not tell me. I simply know him too well." Hermione was blushing furiously now. "It's fine, Miss Granger," said Professor McGonagall hastily. "You're a Ravenclaw in your first year. Nobody expects you to be a Slytherin." That really stung. "Fine," said Hermione with some acerbity. "I'll go ask Harry Potter for Slytherin lessons then." "That wasn't what I wanted to," said Professor McGonagall, and her voice trailed off. "Miss Granger, I'm worried about this because young Ravenclaw girls shouldn't have to be Slytherins. If the headmaster asks you to get involved in something you're not comfortable with, Miss Granger, it really is all right to say no. And if you're feeling pressured, please tell the headmaster that you would like me to be there, or that you would like to ask me first." Hermione's eyes were very wide. "Does the headmaster do things that are wrong?" Professor McGonagall looked a little sad at that. "Not on purpose, Miss Granger, but I think. Well, it probably is true that sometimes the headmaster has trouble remembering what it's like to be a child. Even when he was a child, I'm sure he must have been brilliant and strong of mind and heart, with courage enough for 3 Gryffindors. Sometimes the headmaster asks too much of his young students, Miss Granger, or isn't careful enough not to hurt them. He is a good man, but sometimes his plotting can go too far. But it's good for students to be strong and have courage, said Hermione. That's why you suggested Gryffindor for me, wasn't it? Professor McGonagall smiled wryly. Perhaps I was only being selfish, wanting you for my own house. Did the Sorting Hat offer you? No, I should not have asked. It told me I might go anywhere but Slytherin, said Hermione. She'd almost asked why she wasn't good enough for Slytherin before she'd managed to stop herself. So I have courage, Professor. Professor McGonagall leaned forward over her desk. The worry was showing plainer on her face now. Miss Granger, it's not about courage, it's about what's healthy for young girls. The headmaster is drawing you into his plots. Harry Potter is giving you his secrets to keep, and now you're making alliances with Draco Malfoy. And I promised your mother that you would be safe at Hogwarts. Hermione just didn't know what to say to that. But the thought was occurring to her that Professor McGonagall might not have been warning her if she'd been a boy in Gryffindor instead of a girl in Ravenclaw, and that was, well, I'll try to be good, she said, and I won't let anyone tell me otherwise. Professor McGonagall pressed her hands over her eyes. When she took them away, her lined face looked very old. Yes, she said in a whisper, you would have done well in my house. Stay safe, Miss Granger, and be careful. And if you are ever worried or uncomfortable about anything, please come to me at once. I won't keep you any longer. Aftermath, Draco Malfoy. Neither of them really wanted to do anything complicated that Saturday, not after fighting a battle earlier. So Draco was just sitting in an unused classroom and trying to read a book called Thinking Physics. It was one of the most fascinating things that Draco had ever read in his life, at least the parts he could understand, at least when the accursed idiot who refused to let his books out of his sight could manage to shut up and let Draco concentrate. Hermione Granger is a mood-bloward, sang Harry Potter from where he sat at a nearby desk, reading a far more advanced book of his own. I know what you're trying to do, said Draco calmly, without looking up from the pages. It's not going to work. We're still ganging up and crushing you. A Malfoy is working with a mood-bloward. What will all your father's free-ends think? They'll think Malfoys aren't as easily manipulated as you seem to believe, Potter. The defense professor was crazier than Dumbledore. No future savior of the world could ever be this childish and undignified at any age. Hey, Draco, you know what's really going to suck? You know that Hermione Granger has 2 copies of the magical allele, just like you and just like me. But all your classmates in Slytherin don't know that, and you were not allowed to explain. Draco's fingers were whitening where they gripped the book. Being beaten and spat upon couldn't possibly require this much self-control, and if he didn't get back at Harry soon, he was going to do something incriminating. So what did you wish the first time? Said Draco. Harry didn't say anything, so Draco looked up from his book and felt a twinge of malicious satisfaction at the sad look on Harry's face. Harry said. A lot of people ask me that, but I don't think Professor Quirrell would have wanted me to talk about it. Draco put a serious look on his own face. You can talk about it with me. It's probably not important compared to the other secrets you've told me, and what else are friends for? That's right, I'm your friend. Feel guilty. It wasn't really all that interesting, Harry said with obviously artificial lightness. Just, I wish Professor Quirrell would teach battle magic again next year. Harry sighed and looked back down at his book and said, after another few seconds, your father's probably going to be pretty upset with you this Christmas, but if you promise him that you'll betray the Mudblood girl and wipe out her army, everything will go back to being all right, and you'll still get your Christmas presents. Maybe if he and Granger asked Professor Quirrell extra politely and used some of their Quirrell points, the 2 of them would be allowed to do something more interesting to General Chaos than putting him to sleep. 36. Status differentials. Wrenching disorientation. That was how it felt to walk out of Platform 9 and 3/4 into the rest of Earth. The world that Harry had once thought was the only real world. People dressed in casual shirts and pants instead of the more dignified robes of wizards and witches. Scattered bits of trash here and there around the benches. A forgotten smell, the fumes of burned gasoline, raw and sharp in the air. The ambience of the King's Cross train station, less bright and cheerful than Hogwarts or Diagon Alley. The people seemed smaller, more afraid, and likely would have eagerly traded their problems for a dark wizard to fight. Harry wanted to cast Scourgify for the dirt, and Evertow for the garbage, and if he'd known the spell, a bubblehead charm so he wouldn't have to breathe the air. But he couldn't use his wand in this place. This, Harry realized, must be what it felt like to go from a first-world country to a third-world country. Only it was the zeroth world which Harry had left, the wizarding world of cleansing charms and house elves, where between the healer's arts and your own magic, you could hit 170 before old age really started catching up with you. And non-magical London, Muggle Earth, to which Harry had temporarily returned. This was where Mum and Dad would live out the rest of their lives, unless technology leapfrogged over wizardry's quality of life, or something deeper in the world changed. Without even thinking about it, Harry's head turned, and his eyes darted behind him to see the wooden trunk that was scurrying after him, unnoticed by any muggles, the clawed tentacles offering quick confirmation that, yes, he hadn't just imagined it all. And then there was the other reason for the tight feeling in his chest. His parents didn't know. They didn't know anything. They didn't know. Harry, called a thin, blonde woman whose perfectly smooth and unblemished skin made her look a good deal younger than 33. And Harry realized with a start that it was magic. He hadn't known the signs before, but he could see them now. And whatever sort of potion lasted that long, it must have been terribly dangerous, because most witches didn't do that to themselves. They weren't that desperate. There was water gathering in Harry's eyes. Harry, yelled an older-looking man with a paunch gathering about his stomach, dressed with ostentatious academic carelessness, in a black vest thrown over a dark grey-green shirt, someone who would always be a professor anywhere he went, who would certainly have been one of the most brilliant wizards of his generation if he'd been born with 2 copies of that gene instead of 0. Harry raised his hand and waved to them. He couldn't speak. He couldn't speak at all. They came over to him, not running, but at a steady, dignified walk. That was how fast Professor Michael Vers-Evans walked, and Mrs. Petunia Evans-Vers wasn't about to walk any faster. The smile on his father's face wasn't very wide, but then his father never was given to huge smiles. It was, at least, as wide as Harry had ever seen it, wider than when a new grant came in, or when one of his students got a position, and you couldn't ask for a wider smile than that. Mum was blinking hard, and she was trying to smile, but not doing a very good job. "So," said his father as he came striding up, "made any revolutionary discoveries yet?" Of course, Dad thought he was joking. It hadn't hurt quite so much when his parents didn't believe in him, back when no one else had believed in him either, back when Harry hadn't known how it felt to be taken seriously by people like Headmaster Dumbledore and Professor Quirrell. And that was when Harry realized that the boy who lived only existed in magical Britain, that there wasn't any such person in Muggle London, just a cute little 11-year-old boy going home for Christmas. "Excuse me," Harry said, his voice trembling. "I'm going to break down and cry now. It doesn't mean there was anything wrong at school." Harry started to move forward, and then stopped, torn between hugging his father and hugging his mother. He didn't want either one to feel slighted or that Harry loved them more than the other. "You," said his father, "are a very silly boy, Mr. Vers." And he gently took Harry by the shoulders and pushed him into the arms of his mother, who was kneeling down, tears already streaking her cheek. "Hello, Mum," Harry said with his voice wavering. "I'm back." And he hugged her, amid the noisy mechanical sounds and the smell of burned gasoline. And Harry started crying, because he knew that nothing could go back, least of all him. The sky was completely dark, and stars were coming out. By the time they negotiated the Christmas traffic to the university town that was Oxford, and parked in the driveway of the small, dingy-looking old house that their family used to keep the rain off their books. As they walked up the brief stretch of pavement leading to the front door, they passed a series of flower pots holding small, dim electric lights. Dim, since they had to recharge themselves off solar power during the day, and the lights lit up just as they passed. The hard part had been finding motion sensors that were waterproof and triggered at just the right distance. In Hogwarts, there were real torches like that. And then the front door opened, and Harry stepped into their living room, blinking hard. Every inch of wall space is covered by a bookcase. Each bookcase has 6 shelves, going almost to the ceiling. Some bookshelves are stacked to the brim with hardcover books, science, math, history, and everything else. Other shelves have 2 layers of paperback science fiction, with the back layer of books propped up on old tissue boxes or 2x4s, so that you can see the back layer of books above the books in front. And it still isn't enough. Books are overflowing onto the tables and the sofas and making little heaps under the windows. The Vare's household was just as he'd left it, only with more books, which was also just how he'd left it. And a Christmas tree, naked and undecorated just 2 days before Christmas Eve, which threw Harry briefly before he realized, with a warm feeling blossoming in his chest, that of course his parents had waited. "We took the bed out of your room to make room for more bookcases," said his father. "You can sleep in your trunk, right?" "You can sleep in my trunk," said Harry. "That reminds me," said his father. "What did they end up doing about your sleep cycle?" "Magic," Harry said, making a beeline for the door that opened upon his bedroom, just in case Dad wasn't joking. "That's not an explanation," said Professor Evans, just as Harry shouted, "You used up all the open space on my bookcases." Harry had spent the 23rd of December shopping for Muggle things that he couldn't just transfigure. His father had been busy and had said that Harry would need to walk or take the bus, which had suited Harry just fine. Some of the people at the hardware store had given Harry questioning looks, but he'd said with an innocent voice that his father was shopping nearby and was very busy and had sent him to get some things, holding up a list in carefully adult-looking half-illegible handwriting. And in the end, money was money. They had all decorated the Christmas tree together, and Harry had put a tiny dancing fairy on top, 2 sickles, 5 nuts at Gamble and Japes. Gringotts had readily exchanged galleons for paper money, but they didn't seem to have any simple way to turn larger quantities of gold into tax-free, unsuspicious Muggle money in a numbered Swiss bank account. This had rather spiked Harry's plan to turn most of the money he'd self-stolen into a sensible mix of 60% international index funds and 40% Berkshire Hathaway. For the moment, Harry had diversified his assets a little further by sneaking out late at night, invisible and time-turned, and burying 100 golden galleons in the backyard. He'd always wanted to do that anyway. Some of December 24th had been spent with the professor reading Harry's books and asking questions. Most of the experiments his father had suggested were impractical, at least for the moment. Of those remaining, Harry had done many of them already. "Yes, Dad, I checked what happened if Hermione was given a changed pronunciation, and she didn't know whether it was changed. That was the very first experiment I did, Dad." The last question Harry's father had asked, looking up from magical drafts and potions with an expression of bewildered disgust, was whether it all made sense if you were a wizard, and Harry had answered no. Whereupon his father had declared that magic was unscientific. Harry was still a little shocked at the idea of pointing to a section of reality and calling it unscientific. Dad seemed to think that the conflict between his intuitions and the universe meant that the universe had a problem. Then again, there were lots of physicists who thought that quantum mechanics was weird, instead of quantum mechanics being normal and them being weird. Harry had shown his mother the healer's kit he'd bought to keep in their house, though most of the potions wouldn't work on Dad. Mum had stared at the kit in a way that made Harry ask whether Mum's sister had ever bought anything like that for Grandpa Edwin and Grandma Elaine. And when Mum still hadn't answered, Harry had said hastily that she must have just never thought of it. And then, finally, he'd fled the room. Lily Evans probably hadn't thought of it. That was the sad thing. Harry knew that other people had a tendency to not think about painful subjects, in the same way they had a tendency not to deliberately rest their hands on red-hot stove burners, and Harry was starting to suspect that most Muggle-borns rapidly acquired a tendency to not think about their family, who were all going to die before they reached their first century anyway. Not that Harry had any intention of letting that happen, of course. And then it was late in the day on December 24th, and they were driving off for their Christmas Eve dinner. The house was huge, not by Hogwarts standards, but certainly by the standards of what you could get if your father was a distinguished professor trying to live in Oxford. 2 stories of brick gleaming in the setting sun, with windows on top of windows, and one tall window that went up much further than glass should go. That was going to be one huge living room. Harry took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. There was a distant call of "Honey, can you get it?" This was followed by a slow patter of approaching steps. And then the door opened to reveal a genial man of fat and rosy cheeks and thinning hair in a blue button-down shirt straining slightly at the seams. "Dr. Granger," Harry's father said briskly, before Harry could even speak. "I'm Michael, and this is Petunia and our son Harry. The food's in the magical trunk," and Dad made a vague gesture behind him, not quite in the direction of the trunk, as it happened. "Yes, please, come in," said Leo Granger. He stepped forward and took the wine bottle from the professor's outstretched hands with a muttered "thank you," and then stepped back and waved at the living room. "Have a seat." And his head turning down to address Harry. "All the toys are downstairs in the basement. I'm sure Herm will be down shortly. It's the first door on your right," and pointed toward a hallway. Harry just looked at him for a moment, conscious that he was blocking his parents from coming in. "Toys," said Harry in a bright, high-pitched voice with his eyes wide. "I love toys." There was an intake of breath from his mother behind him, and Harry strode into the house, managing not to stomp too hard as he walked. The living room was every bit as large as it had looked from outside, with a huge vaulted ceiling dangling a gigantic chandelier, and a Christmas tree that must have been murder to maneuver through the door. The lower levels of the tree were thoroughly and carefully decorated in neat patterns of red and green and gold, with a newfound sprinkling of blue and bronze. The heights that only a grown-up could reach were carelessly, randomly draped with strings of lights and wreaths of tinsel. A hallway extended until it terminated in the cabinetry of a kitchen, and wooden stairs with polished metal railings stretched up toward a second floor. "Gosh," Harry said, "this is a big house. I hope I don't get lost in here." Dr. Roberta Granger was feeling rather nervous as dinner approached. Turkey and the roast, their own contributions to the common project, were steadily cooking away in the oven. The other dishes were to be brought by their guests, the Vere family, who had adopted a boy named Harry, who was known to the wizarding world as the boy who lived, and who was also the only boy that Hermione had ever called cute, or noticed at all, really. The Vereses had said that Hermione was the only child in Harry's age group whose existence their son had ever acknowledged in any way whatsoever. And it might have been jumping the gun just a little, but both couples had a sneaking suspicion that wedding bells might be in the offing a few years down the road. So while Christmas Day would be spent, as always, with her husband's family, they decided to spend Christmas Eve meeting their daughter's possible future in-laws. The doorbell rang while she was right in the middle of basting the turkey, and she raised her voice and shouted, "Honey, can you get it?" There was a brief groan of a chair and its occupant, and then there was the sound of her husband's heavy footsteps and the door swinging open. "Dr. Granger," said an older man's brisk voice. "I'm Michael, and this is Petunia and our son Harry. The food's in the magical trunk." "Yes, please, come in," said her husband, followed by a muttered "thank you" that indicated some sort of present had been accepted, and "have a seat." Then Leo's voice altered to a tone of artificial enthusiasm and said, "And all the toys are downstairs in the basement. I'm sure Herm will be down shortly. It's the first door on your right." There was a brief pause. Then a young boy's bright voice said, "Toys. I love toys." There was the sound of footsteps entering the house, and then the same bright voice said, "Gosh, this is a big house. I hope I don't get lost in here." Roberta closed up the oven, smiling. She'd been a bit worried about the way Hermione's letters had described the boy who lived, though certainly her daughter hadn't said anything indicating that Harry Potter was dangerous. Nothing like the dark hints written in the books Roberta had bought, supposedly for Hermione, during their trip to Diagon Alley. Her daughter hadn't said much at all, only that Harry talked like he came out of a book, and Hermione was studying harder than she ever had in her life, just to stay ahead of him in class. But from the sound of it, Harry Potter was an ordinary 11-year-old boy. She got to the front door just as her daughter came clattering frantically down the stairs at a speed that didn't look safe at all. Hermione had claimed that witches were more resistant to falls, but Roberta wasn't quite sure she believed that. Roberta took in her first sight of Professor and Mrs. Veres, who were both looking rather nervous, just as the boy with the legendary scar on his forehead turned to her daughter and said, now in a lower voice, "Well met on this fairest of evenings, Miss Granger." His hand stretched back, as though offering his parents on a silver platter. "I present to you my father, Professor Michael Veres Evans, and my mother, Mrs. Petunia Evans Veres." And as Roberta's mouth was gaping open, the boy turned back to his parents and said, now in that bright voice again, "Mum, Dad, this is Hermione. She's really smart." "Harry," hissed her daughter. "Stop that." The boy swiveled again to regard Hermione. "I'm afraid, Miss Granger," the boy said gravely, "that you and I have been exiled to the labyrinthine recesses of the basement. Let us leave them to their adult conversations, which would no doubt soar far above our own childish intellects, and resume our ongoing discussion of the implications of Humean projectivism for transfiguration." "Excuse us, please," said her daughter in a very firm tone, and grabbed the boy by his left sleeve, and dragged him into the hallway. Roberta swiveled helplessly to track them as they went past her. The boy gave her a cheery wave, and then Hermione pulled the boy into the basement access and slammed the door behind her. I apologize for," said Mrs. Vez in a faltering voice. "I'm sorry," said the professor, smiling fondly. "Harry can be a bit touchy about that sort of thing. But I expect he's right about us not being interested in their conversation." "Is he dangerous?" Roberta wanted to ask, but she kept her silence and tried to think of subtler questions. Her husband beside her was chuckling, as if he'd found what they'd just seen funny rather than frightening. The most terrible Dark Lord in history had tried to kill that boy, and the burnt husk of his body had been found next to the crib. Her possible future son-in-law. Roberta had been increasingly apprehensive about giving her daughter over to witchcraft, especially after she'd read the books, put the dates together, and realized that her magical mother had probably been killed at the height of Grindelwald's terror, not died giving birth to her as her father had always claimed. But Professor McGonagall had made other visits after her first trip to see how Miss Granger is doing, and Roberta couldn't help but think that if Hermione said her parents were being troublesome about her witching career, something would be done to fix them. Roberta put her best smile on her face and did what she could to spread some pretended Christmas cheer. The dining room table was much longer than 6 people, 4 people and 2 children, really needed, but all of it was draped with a tablecloth of fine white linen, and the dishes had been needlessly transferred to fancy serving plates, which at least were of stainless steel rather than real silver. Harry was having a bit of trouble concentrating on the turkey. The conversation had turned to Hogwarts, naturally, and it had been obvious to Harry that his parents were hoping that Hermione would trip up and say more about Harry's school life than Harry had been telling them. And either Hermione had realized this, or she was just automatically steering clear of anything that might prove troublesome. So Harry was fine. But unfortunately, Harry had made the mistake of owling his parents with all sorts of facts about Hermione that she hadn't told her own parents. Like that she was general of an army in their after-school activities. Hermione's mother had looked very alarmed, and Harry had quickly interrupted and done his best to explain that all the spells were stunners. Professor Quirrell was always watching, and the existence of magical healing meant that lots of things were much less dangerous than they sounded, at which point Hermione had kicked him hard under the table. Thankfully, Harry's father, who Harry had to admit was better than him at some things, had announced with firm professorial authority that he hadn't worried at all, since he couldn't imagine children being allowed to do it if it was dangerous. That wasn't why Harry was having trouble enjoying dinner, though. The problem with feeling sorry for yourself was that it never took any time at all to find someone else who had it worse. Dr. Leo Granger had asked, at one point, whether that nice teacher who'd seemed to like Hermione, Professor McGonagall, was awarding her lots of points in school. Hermione had said yes, with an apparently genuine smile. Harry had managed, with some effort, to stop himself from icily pointing out that Professor McGonagall would never show favoritism to any Hogwarts student, and that Hermione was getting lots of points because she'd earned every single one. At another point, Leo Granger had offered the table his opinion that Hermione was very smart and could have gone to medical school and become a dentist, if not for the whole witch business. Hermione had smiled again, and a quick glance had prevented Harry from suggesting Hermione might also have been an internationally famous scientist, and asking whether that thought would have occurred to the Grangers if they'd had a son instead of a daughter, or if it was unacceptable either way for their offspring to do better than them. But Harry was rapidly reaching his boiling point. and becoming a lot more appreciative of the fact that his own father had always done everything he could to support Harry's development as a prodigy, and always encouraged him to reach higher and never belittled a single one of his accomplishments, even if a child prodigy was still just a child. Was this the sort of household he could have ended up in if Mum had married Vernon Dursley? Harry was doing what he could, though. And she's really beating you in all your classes except broomstick riding and transfiguration, said Professor Michael Evans. Yes, Harry said with forced calm as he cut himself another bite of Christmas Eve turkey. By solid margins, in most of them. There were other circumstances under which Harry would have been more reluctant to admit that, which was why he hadn't gotten around to telling his father until now. Hermione has always been quite good in school, said Dr. Leo Granger in a satisfied tone. Harry competes at the national level, said Professor Michael Evans. Dear, said Petunia. Hermione was giggling, and that wasn't making Harry feel any better about her situation. It didn't seem to bother Hermione, and that bothered Harry. I'm not embarrassed to lose to her, Dad, Harry said. Right at this moment he wasn't. Did I mention that she memorized all her school books before the first day of class? And yes, I tested it. Is that, usual for her? Professor Evans said to the Grangers. Oh, yes, Hermione's always memorizing things, said Dr. Roberta Granger with a cheerful smile. She knows every recipe in all my cookbooks by heart. I miss her every time I make dinner. Judging by the look on his father's face, Dad was feeling at least some of what Harry felt. Don't worry, Dad, Harry said. She's getting all the advanced material she can take now. Her teachers at Hogwarts know she's smart, unlike her parents. His voice had risen on the last three words, and even as all faces turned to stare at him and Hermione kicked him again, Harry knew that he'd blown it, but it was too much, just way too much. Of course we know she's smart, said Leo Granger, starting to look offended at the child who'd had the temerity to raise his voice at their dinner table. You don't have the tiniest idea, said Harry, the ice now leaking into his voice. You think she reads a lot of books, and it's cute, right? You see a perfect report card, and you think it's good that she's doing well in class. Your daughter is the most talented witch of her generation and the brightest star of Hogwarts, and someday, Dr. Granger, the fact that you were her parents will be the only reason that history remembers you. Hermione, who had calmly got up from her seat and walked around the table, chose that moment to grab Harry's shirt by the shoulder and pull him out of his chair. Harry let himself be pulled, but as Hermione dragged him away, he said, raising his voice even louder, "It is entirely possible that in 1,000 years, the fact that Hermione Granger's parents were dentists will be the only reason anyone remembers dentistry." Roberta stared at where her daughter had just dragged the boy who lived out of the room with a patient look upon her young face. "I'm terribly sorry," said Professor Vez with an amused smile. "But please don't worry. Harry always talks like that. Aren't they just like a married couple already?" The frightening thing was that they were. Harry had been expecting a rather severe lecture from Hermione. But after Hermione pulled them into the basement access and closed the door behind them, she turned around and was smiling, genuinely so far as Harry could tell. "Please don't, Harry," she said in a soft voice. "Even though it's very nice of you, everything's fine." Harry just looked at her. "How can you stand it?" he said. He had to keep his voice quiet. They didn't want the parents to hear, but it rose in pitch if not in volume. "How can you stand it?" Hermione shrugged and said, "Because that's the way parents should be." "No," Harry said, his voice low and intense. "It's not. My father never puts me down well, he does, but never like that." Hermione held up a single finger, and Harry waited, watching her search for words. It took her a while before she said, "Harry, Professor McGonagall and Professor Flitwick like me because I'm the most talented witch of my generation and the brightest star of Hogwarts. And Mum and Dad don't know that, and you'll never be able to tell them, but they love me anyway. Which means that everything is just the way it should be, at Hogwarts and at home. And since they're my parents, Mr. Potter, you don't get to argue." She was once again smiling her mysterious smile from dinner time and looking at Harry very fondly. "Is that clear, Mr. Potter?" Harry nodded tightly. "Good," said Hermione, and leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. The conversation had only just gotten started again when a distant high-pitched yelp floated back to them. "Hey, no kissing." The two fathers burst out in laughter just as the two mothers rose up from their chairs with identical looks of horror and dashed toward the basement. When the children had been brought back, Hermione was saying in an icy tone that she was never going to kiss Harry ever again, and Harry was saying in an outraged voice that the sun would burn down to a cold, dead cinder before he let her get close enough to try, which meant that everything was just the way it should be, and they all sat back down again to finish their Christmas dinner. 37. Interlude, Crossing the Boundary. It was almost midnight. Staying up late was simple enough for Harry. He just hadn't used the time turner. Harry followed a tradition of timing his sleep cycle to make sure he was awake for when Christmas Eve turned into Christmas Day, because while he'd never been young enough to believe in Santa Claus, he'd once been young enough to doubt. It would have been nice if there had been a mysterious figure who entered your house in the night and brought you presents. A chill went down Harry's spine then. An intimation of something dreadful approaching, a creeping terror, a sense of doom. Harry sat bolt upright in bed. He looked at the window. Professor Quirrell. Harry shrieked very quietly. Professor Quirrell made a slight lifting gesture, and Harry's window seemed to fold into its frame. At once, a cold gust of winter blew into the room through the gap, along with a scant few flakes of snow from a sky spotted with grey night clouds amid the black and stars. "Fear not, Mr. Potter," said the defense professor in a normal voice. "I have charmed your parents asleep. They shall not wake until I have departed." "No one's supposed to know where I am," said Harry, still keeping the shriek quiet. "Even owls are supposed to deliver my mail to Hogwarts, not here." Harry had agreed to that willingly. It would be silly if a Death Eater could win the whole war at any time just by owling him a magically triggered hand grenade. Professor Quirrell was grinning from where he stood in the backyard beyond the window. "Oh, I shouldn't worry, Mr. Potter. You are well protected against locating charms, and no blood purist is likely to think of consulting a phone book." His grin grew wider, and it did take considerable effort to cross the wards that the headmaster put around this house, though of course anyone who knew your address could simply wait outside and attack you the next time you left. Harry stared at Professor Quirrell for a while. "What are you doing here?" Harry said finally. The smile left Professor Quirrell's face. "I've come to apologize, Mr. Potter," the defense professor said quietly. "I should not have spoken to you so harshly as I don't," Harry said. He looked down at the blanket that he was clutching around his pajamas. "Just don't." "Have I offended you that much?" said Professor Quirrell's quiet voice. "No," Harry said, "but you will if you apologize." "I see," said Professor Quirrell, and in an instant his voice grew stern. "Then if I am to treat you as an equal, Mr. Potter, I should say that you have gravely violated the etiquette that holds between friendly Slytherins. If you are not currently playing the game against someone, you must not meddle in their plans like that, not without asking them before. For you do not know what their true design may be, nor what stakes they may lose. It would mark you as their enemy, Mr. Potter." "Sorry," Harry said, in just the same quiet tone that Professor Quirrell had used. "Apology accepted," said Professor Quirrell. "But," Harry said, still quietly, "you and I really must speak further on politics at some point." Professor Quirrell sighed. "I know you dislike condescension, Mr. Potter. That was a bit of an understatement. But it would be even more condescending," said Professor Quirrell, "if I were not to state it clearly. You are missing some life experience, Mr. Potter." "And does everyone who has sufficient life experience agree with you then?" said Harry calmly. "What good is life experience to someone who plays Quidditch?" said Professor Quirrell and shrugged. "I think you will change your mind in time, after every trust you place has failed you, and you have become cynical." The defense professor said it as though it were the most ordinary statement in the world, framed against the black and the stars and the cloud-spotted sky as one or two tiny snowflakes blew past him in the biting winter air. "That reminds me," said Harry. "Merry Christmas." "I suppose," said Professor Quirrell. "After all, if it is not an apology, then it must be a Christmas gift. The very first one I have ever given, in fact." Harry hadn't even started yet on learning Latin, so he could read the experimental diary of Roger Bacon, and he hardly dared open his mouth to ask. "Put on your winter coat," said Professor Quirrell, "or take a warming potion if you have one, and meet me outside under the stars. I shall see if I can maintain it a little longer this time." It took Harry a moment to process the words, and then he was dashing for the coat closet. Professor Quirrell kept the spell of starlight going for more than an hour, though the defense professor's face grew strained, and he had to sit down after a while. Harry protested only once and was shushed. They crossed the boundary from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day within that timeless void where earthly rotations meant nothing, the one true everlasting silent night. And just as promised, Harry's parents slept soundly all through it, until Harry was safely back in his room and the defense professor had gone. 38. The Cardinal Sin. Bright the sun, bright the air, bright the students and bright their parents, clean the paved ground of Platform 9. 75. The winter sun hanging low in the sky at 9:45 a.m. in the morning on January 5th, 1992. Some of the younger students wore scarves and mittens, but most simply wore their robes. They were wizards, after all. After Harry had moved away from the landing platform, he took off his scarf and coat, opened a compartment of his trunk, and stowed away his winter things. For a long moment, he stood there letting the January air bite at him, just to see what it was like. Harry took out his wizard's robes, shrugged them on, and finally, Harry drew his wand, and he couldn't help thinking of the parents he'd only just kissed goodbye, of the world whose problems he was leaving behind. With a strange feeling of guilt for the unavoidable, Harry said, "Thermos." The warmth flowed through him, and the boy who lived was back. Harry yawned and stretched, feeling more lethargic than anything else at the conclusion of his vacation. He didn't feel like reading his textbooks or even any serious science fiction this morning. What he needed was something completely frivolous to occupy his attention. Well, that wouldn't be hard to come by if he was willing to part with 4 nuts. Besides, if the Daily Prophet was corrupt and the Quibbler was the only competing newspaper, there might be some suppressed real news in there. Harry trudged back over to the same newsstand from last time, wondering if the Quibbler could top the headline he'd seen before. The vendor started to smile as Harry approached, and then the man's face suddenly changed as he caught sight of the scar. "Harry Potter," gasped the vendor. "No, Mr. Durian," said Harry, eyes dipping briefly to the man's name tag. Just an amazing imitation, and then Harry's voice stopped in his throat as he caught sight of the top fold of the Quibbler. "Sloshed seer spills secrets. Dark Lord to return." For just an instant, Harry tried to clamp down on his face, before realizing that not being shocked could be just as revealing in a sense. "Excuse me," Harry said. His voice sounded a little alarmed, and he didn't even know whether that was too revealing or just what his normal reaction would be if he didn't know anything. He'd spent too much time around Slytherins. He was forgetting how to keep secrets from ordinary people. 4 nuts hit the counter. "1 copy of the Quibbler, please." "Oh, no worries, Mr. Potter," said the vendor hastily, waving his hands. "It's never mind, just." A newspaper flew through the air and hit Harry's fingers, and he unfolded it. "Sloshed seer spills secrets. Dark Lord to return. Wed Draco Malfoy. It's free," said the vendor. "For you, I mean." "No," Harry said. "I was going to buy one anyway." The vendor took the coins, and Harry read on. "Gosh," Harry said half a minute later. "You get a seer smashed on 6 slugs of scotch, and she spills all sorts of secret stuff." Who'd have thought that Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew were secretly the same person? "Not me," said the vendor. "They've even got a picture of the 2 of them together, so we know who it is that's secretly the same person." "Yup," said the vendor. "Pretty clever disguise in it. And I'm secretly 65 years old." "You don't look half that," the vendor said amiably. "And I'm betrothed to Hermione Granger and Bellatrix Black and Luna Lovegood, and oh yes, Draco Malfoy too." "Goin' to be one interesting wedding," said the vendor. Harry looked up from the newspaper and said in a pleasant voice, "You know, I heard at first that Luna Lovegood was insane, and I wondered if she really was, or if she was just making stuff up and giggling to herself the whole time. Then when I read my second Quibbler headline, I decided that she couldn't be insane. It can't be easy to make this stuff up. You couldn't do it by accident. And now do you know what I think? I think she must be mad after all. When ordinary people try to make stuff up, it doesn't come out like this. Something's got to go really wrong with the inside of your head before this is what comes out when you start making stuff up." The vendor stared at Harry. "Seriously," said Harry. "Who reads this stuff?" "You," said the vendor. Harry wandered off to read his newspaper. He didn't sit at the same nearby table he'd sat down at with Draco the first time he'd prepared to board this train. That seemed like tempting history to repeat itself. It wasn't just that his first week at Hogwarts had been, judging by the quibbler, 54 years long. It was that, in Harry's humble opinion, his life did not need any new threads of complexity. So Harry found a small iron chair somewhere else, distant from the main crowd and the occasional muffled cracks of parents apparating in with their children, and sat down and read the quibbler to see if it contained any suppressed news. And besides the obvious craziness, heaven help them all if any of that was real, there was a good deal of snide romantic gossip, but nothing that would really be all that important if it was true. Harry was just reading about the ministry's proposed marriage law to ban all marriages, when Harry Potter, said a silken voice that sent a shock of adrenaline jolting through Harry's blood. Harry looked up. Lucius Malfoy, Harry said, his voice weary. Next time he was going to do the smart thing and wait outside in the Muggle part of King's Cross until 10:55 a.m. Lucius inclined his head courteously, sending his long white hair drifting over his shoulders. The man was still carrying that same cane, lacquered in black with a silver snake's head for its handle, and something about his grip silently said this is a weapon of deadly power, not I am feeble and leaning on this. His face was expressionless. Two men flanked him, their eyes continuously scanning, their wands already gripped low in their hands. The two of them moved like a single organism with 4 legs and 4 arms, the senior Crabbe and Goyle, and Harry thought he could guess which was which. But then it didn't really matter. They were merely Lucius's appendages, as certainly as if they'd been the 2 rightmost toes on his left foot. I apologize for disturbing you, Mr. Potter, said the smooth, silken voice. But you have answered none of my owls, and this I thought might be my only opportunity to meet you. I have received none of your owls, Harry said calmly. Dumbledore intercepted them, I presume, but I would not have answered them if I had, except through Draco. For me to deal with you directly without Draco's knowledge would trespass on our friendship. Please go away, please go away. The grey eyes glittered at him. Is that your pose, then? Said the senior Malfoy. Well, I shall play along a little. What was your purpose in maneuvering your good friend, my son, into a public alliance with that girl? Oh, Harry said lightly, that's obvious, right? Draco's working with Granger will make him realize that Muggleborns are human after all. BWA, ha. A thin trace of a smile moved over Lucius's lips. Yes, that does sound like one of Dumbledore's plans, which it is not. Indeed, said Harry. Is part of my game with Draco, and no work of Dumbledore's, and that is all I will say. Let us dispense with games, said the senior Malfoy, the grey eyes suddenly hardening. If my suspicions are true, you would hardly do Dumbledore's bidding in any case, Mr. Potter. There was a slight pause. So you know, Harry said, his voice cold. Tell me, at which point exactly did you realize? When I read your response to Professor Quirrell's little speech, said the white-haired man, and chuckled grimly. I was puzzled at first, for it seemed not in your own interest. It took me days to understand whose interest was being served, and then it all finally became clear. And it is also obvious that you are weak, in some ways if not others. Very clever of you, said Harry, still cold. But perhaps you mistake my interests. Perhaps I do. A hint of steel came into the silken voice. Indeed, that is precisely what I fear. You are playing strange games with my son, to a purpose I cannot guess. That is not a friendly act, and you cannot but expect me to be concerned. Lucius was leaning upon his cane with both hands now, and both those hands white, and his bodyguards had suddenly tensed. Some instinct within Harry claimed that it would be a very bad idea to show his fear, to let Lucius see that he could be intimidated. They were in a public train station anyway. I find it interesting, Harry said, putting steel into his own voice, that you think I could benefit from doing Draco harm. But it is irrelevant, Lucius. He is my friend, and I do not betray my friends. What? Whispered Lucius. His face showed sheer shock. Then company, said one of the minions, and Harry thought from the voice that it must be the senior Crabbe. Lucius straightened and turned, then let out a hiss of disapproval. Neville was approaching, looking scared but determined, in tow behind a tall woman who didn't look scared at all. Madam Longbottom, Lucius said icily. Mr. Malfoy, returned the woman with equal ice. Are you being an annoyance to our Harry Potter? The bark of laughter that came from Lucius seemed strangely bitter. Oh, I rather think not. Come to protect him from me, have you? The white-haired head shifted toward Neville. And this would be Mr. Potter's loyal lieutenant, the last scion of Longbottom, Neville, self-styled of chaos. How strangely does the world turn. Sometimes I think it must all be mad. Harry had no idea at all what to say to that, and Neville looked confused and frightened. I doubt it is the world that is mad, said Madame Longbottom. Her voice took on a gloating tone. You seem in a poor mood, Mr. Malfoy. Did the speech of our dear Professor Quirrell cost you a few allies? It was a clever enough slander of my abilities, Lucius said coldly, though only effective upon the fools who believed that I was truly a Death Eater. What? Blurted Neville. I was under the imperious, young man, said Lucius, now sounding tired. The Dark Lord could hardly have begun recruiting among pureblood families without the support of House Malfoy. I demurred, and he simply made sure of me. His own Death Eaters did not know it until afterward, hence the false mark I bear, though since I did not truly consent, it does not bind me. Some of the Death Eaters still believe I was foremost among their number, and for the peace of this nation I let them believe it, to keep them controlled. But I was not such a fool as to support that ill-fated adventurer of my own choice. Ignore him, Madame Longbottom said, the instruction addressed to Harry as well as Neville. He must spend the rest of his life pretending, for fear of your testimony under Veritaserum, said with malicious satisfaction. Lucius turned his back on her dismissively and faced Harry again. Will you request this Herodin to depart, Mr. Potter? I think not, said Harry in a dry voice. I prefer to deal with the part of House Malfoy that's my own age. There was a long pause then. The grey eyes searched him. Of course, said Lucius slowly. I do feel the fool now. This whole time you were just pretending to have no idea what we were talking about. Harry met the gaze and said nothing. Lucius raised his cane a few centimeters and struck it hard on the ground. The world vanished in a pale haze. All sounds went quiet. There was nothing in the universe but Harry and Lucius Malfoy and the snake-headed cane. My son is my heart, said the senior Malfoy. The last worthwhile thing I have left in this world, and this I say to you in a spirit of friendship. If he were to come to harm, I would give my life over to vengeance. But so long as my son does not come to harm, I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors. And as you have asked nothing more of me, I will ask nothing more of you. Then the pale haze vanished, showing an outraged Madame Longbottom being blocked from moving forward by the senior crab. Her wand was in her hand now. How dare you, she hissed. Lucius's dark robes swirled around him, and his white hair as he turned to the senior Goyle. We returned to Malfoy Manor. Were 3 pops of apparition, and they were gone. A silence followed. Dear heavens, said Madame Longbottom. What was that about? Harry shrugged helplessly. Then he looked at Neville. There was sweat on Neville's forehead. Thank you very much, Neville, said Harry. Your help was greatly appreciated, Neville. And now, Neville, I think you should sit down. Yes, General, said Neville, and instead of coming over to one of the other chairs near Harry, he semi-collapsed into a sitting position on the pavement. You have wrought many changes in my grandson, said Madame Longbottom. I approve of some, but not others. Send me the list of which is which, said Harry. I'll see what I can do. Neville groaned, but said nothing. Madame Longbottom gave a chuckle. I shall, young man, thank you. Her voice lowered. Mr. Potter, the speech given by Professor Quirrell is something our nation has long needed to hear. I cannot say as much of your comment on it. I will take your opinion under advisement, Harry said mildly. I dearly hope that you do, said Madame Longbottom, and turned back to her grandson. Do I still need to? It's okay for you to go, Grandma, said Neville. I'll be fine on my own this time. Now that I approve of, she said, and popped and vanished like a soap bubble. The 2 boys sat quietly for a moment. Neville spoke first, his voice weary. You're going to try to fix all the changes she approves of, right? Not all of them, Harry said innocently. I just want to make sure I'm not corrupting you. Draco looked very worried. His head kept darting around, despite the fact that Draco had insisted on them going down into Harry's trunk and using a true quieting charm and not just the sound-blurring barrier. What did you say to Father? Blurted Draco, the moment the quieting charm went up and the sounds of platform 934 vanished. Look, can you tell me what he said to you before he dropped you off? Said Harry. That I should tell him right away if you seemed to be threatening me, said Draco. That I should tell him right away if there was anything I was doing that could pose a threat to you. Father thinks you're dangerous, Harry. Whatever you said to him today, it scared him. It's not a good idea to scare Father. Oh, hell. What did you talk about? Demanded Draco. Harry leaned back wearily in the small folding chair that sat at the bottom of his trunk's cavern. You know, Draco, just as the fundamental question of rationality is what do I think I know, and how do I think I know it? There's also a cardinal sin, a way of thinking that's the opposite of that, like the ancient Greek philosophers. They had no clue what was going on, so they go around saying things like all is water or all is fire. And they never asked themselves, wait a minute, even if everything is water, how could I possibly know that? They didn't ask themselves if they had evidence which discriminated that possibility from all the other possibilities you could imagine. Evidence they'd be very unlikely to encounter if the theory wasn't true. Harry, Draco said, his voice strained. What did you talk about with Father? I don't know, actually, said Harry. So it's very important that I not just make stuff up. Harry had never heard Draco shriek in horror in quite that high a pitch before. 39. Pretending to be wise, PT1. Whistle, tick, bzzzt, ding, glorp, pop, splat, chime, toot, puff, tinkle, bubble, beep, thud, crackle, whoosh, hiss, pffft. Whir. Professor Flitwick had silently passed Harry a folded parchment during Charms class that Monday, and the note had said that Harry was to visit the headmaster at his convenience and in such fashion that no one else would notice, especially not Draco Malfoy or Professor Quirrell. His one-time password for the gargoyle would be squeamish ossifrage. This had been accompanied by a remarkably artistic ink drawing of Professor Flitwick staring at him sternly, the eyes of which occasionally blinked. And at the bottom of the note, underlined 3 times, was the phrase, "Don't get into trouble." And so Harry had finished up Transfiguration class, and studied with Hermione, and eaten dinner, and spoken with his lieutenants. And finally, when the clock struck 9, turned himself invisible and dropped back to 6 p.m. and wearily trudged off toward the gargoyle, the turning spiral stairs, the wooden door, the room full of little fiddly things, and the silver-bearded figure of the headmaster. This time Dumbledore looked quite serious, the customary smile absent, and he was dressed in pajamas of a darker and more sober purple than usual. "Thank you for coming, Harry," said the headmaster. The old wizard rose from his throne, began to slowly pace through the room and the strange devices. "First, do you have with you the notes of yesterday's encounter with Lucius Malfoy?" "Notes," blurted Harry. "Surely you wrote it down," said the old wizard, and his voice trailed off. Harry felt rather embarrassed. Yes, if you just fumbled through a mysterious conversation full of significant hints you didn't understand, the bloody obvious thing to do would be to write it all down immediately afterward, before the memory faded, so you could try to figure it out later. "All right," said the headmaster. "From memory, then." Harry sheepishly recited as best he could, and got almost halfway through before he realized that it wasn't smart to just go around telling the possibly crazy headmaster everything, at least not without thinking about it first. But then Lucius was definitely a bad guy and Dumbledore's opponent, so it probably was a good idea to tell him. And Harry had already started talking, and it was too late to try and calculate things out now. Harry finished his recollections honestly. Dumbledore's face had grown more remote as Harry went on, and at the end there was a look of ancientness about him, a sternness in the air. "Well," said Dumbledore, "I suggest you take the best of care that the heir of Malfoy does not come to harm then, and I will do the same." The headmaster was frowning, his fingers drumming soundlessly through the inky black surface of a plate inscribed with the word Lelial. "And I think it would be most extremely wise for you to avoid all interaction with Lord Malfoy henceforth." "Did you intercept owls from him to me?" said Harry. The headmaster gazed at Harry for a long moment, then reluctantly nodded. For some reason, Harry wasn't feeling as outraged as he should have been. Maybe it was just that Harry was finding it very easy to sympathize with the headmaster's point of view right now. Even Harry could understand why Dumbledore wouldn't want him to interact with Lucius Malfoy. It didn't seem like an evil deed. Not like the headmaster blackmailing Zabini, for which they had only Zabini's word, and Zabini was wildly untrustworthy. In fact, it was hard to see why Zabini wouldn't just tell the story that got him the most sympathy from Professor Quirrell. "How about if, instead of protesting, I say that I understand your point of view," said Harry, "and you go on intercepting my owls, but you tell me who from?" "I have intercepted a great many owls to you, I am afraid," Dumbledore said soberly. You are a celebrity, Harry, and you would receive dozens of letters a day, some from far outside this country. Did I not turn them back? That, Harry said, now starting to feel a bit of indignation, seems like going a little too far. Many of those letters, the old wizard said quietly, will be asking you for things you cannot give. I have not read them, of course, only turned them back to their senders undelivered. But I know, for I receive them too. And you are too young, Harry, to have your heart broken 6 times before breakfast each morning. Harry looked down at his shoes. He should insist on reading the letters and judging for himself, but there was a small voice of common sense inside him, and it was screaming very loudly right now. Thank you, Harry muttered. The other reason I asked you here, said the old wizard, was that I wished to consult your unique genius. Transfiguration, said Harry, surprised and flattered. No, not that unique genius, said Dumbledore. Tell me, Harry, what evil could you accomplish if a Dementor were allowed onto the grounds of Hogwarts? It developed that Professor Quirrell had asked, or rather demanded, that his students test their skills against an actual Dementor after they learn the words and gestures to the Patronus charm. Professor Quirrell is unable to cast the Patronus charm himself, said Dumbledore, as he paced slowly through the devices, which is never a good sign. But then he volunteered that fact to me in the course of demanding that outside instructors be brought in to teach the Patronus charm to every student who wished to learn. He offered to pay the expense himself, if I would not. This impressed me greatly. But now he insists on bringing in a Dementor. Headmaster, Harry said quietly. Professor Quirrell believes very strongly in live-fire tests under realistic combat conditions. Wanting to bring in an actual Dementor is completely in character for him. Now the headmaster was giving Harry a strange look. In character, said the old wizard. I mean, said Harry, it's entirely consistent with the way Professor Quirrell usually acts. Harry trailed off. Why had he put it that way? The headmaster nodded. So you have the same sense I do, that it is an excuse. A very reasonable excuse, to be sure, more so than you may realize. Often, wizards seemingly unable to cast a Patronus charm will succeed in the presence of an actual Dementor, going from not a single flicker of light to a full corporeal Patronus. Why this should be, no one knows, but it is so. Harry frowned. Then I really don't see why you're suspicious. The headmaster spread his hands as though in helplessness. Harry, the defense professor has asked me to pass the darkest of all creatures through the gates of Hogwarts. I must be suspicious. The headmaster sighed. And yet the Dementor will be guarded, warded in a mighty cage. I will be there myself to watch it at all times. I cannot think of what ill could be done. But perhaps I am merely unable to see it, and so I am asking you. Harry stared at the headmaster with his mouth open. He was so shocked he couldn't even feel flattered. Me, said Harry. Yes, said Dumbledore, smiling slightly. I try my best to anticipate my foes, to encompass their wicked minds, and predict their evil thoughts. But I would never have imagined sharpening a Hufflepuff's bones into weapons. Was Harry ever going to live that down? Headmaster, Harry said wearily, I know it doesn't sound good, but in all seriousness, I'm not evil, I'm just very creative. I did not say that you were evil, Dumbledore said seriously. There are those who say that to comprehend evil is to become evil, but they are merely pretending to be wise. Rather it is evil which does not know love, and dares not imagine love, and cannot ever understand love without ceasing to be evil. And I suspect that you can imagine your way into the minds of dark wizards better than I ever could, while still knowing love yourself. So, Harry, the headmaster's eyes were intent. If you stood in Professor Quirrell's shoes, what misdeeds could you accomplish after you tricked me into allowing a Dementor onto the grounds of Hogwarts? Hold on, said Harry, and in something of a daze trudged over to the chair in front of the headmaster's desk and sat down. It was a large and comfortable chair this time, not a wooden stool, and Harry could feel himself enveloped as he sank into it. Dumbledore was asking him to outwit Professor Quirrell. Point 1. Harry was rather fonder of Professor Quirrell than of Dumbledore. Point 2. The hypothesis was that the defense professor was planning to do something evil, and in that subjunctive case, Harry ought to be helping the headmaster prevent it. Point 3. Headmaster, Harry said, if Professor Quirrell is up to something, I'm not sure I can outwit him. He's got a lot more experience than I do. The old wizard shook his head. somehow managing to appear very solemn despite his smile. "You underestimate yourself." That was the first time anyone had ever said that to Harry. "I remember," the old wizard continued, "a young man in this very office, cold and controlled as he faced down the head of House Slytherin, blackmailing his own headmaster to protect his classmates. And I believe that young man is more cunning than Professor Quirrell, more cunning than Lucius Malfoy, that he will grow to be the equal of Voldemort himself. It is he who I wish to consult." Harry suppressed the chill that went through him at the name, frowned thoughtfully at the headmaster. How much does he know? The headmaster had seen Harry in the grip of his mysterious dark side, as deep as Harry had ever sunk into it. Harry still remembered what it had been like to watch, invisibly time turned, as his past self faced down the older Slytherins, the boy with the scar on his forehead who didn't act like the others. Of course, the headmaster would have noticed something odd about the boy in his office. And Dumbledore had concluded that his pet hero had cunning to match his destined foe, the Dark Lord, which wasn't asking for very much, considering that the Dark Lord had put a clearly visible dark mark on all of his servants' left arms, and that he'd slaughtered the entire monastery that taught the martial art he'd wanted to learn. Enough cunning to match Professor Quirrell would be a whole different order of problem. But it was also clear that the headmaster wouldn't be satisfied until Harry went all cold and darkish and came up with some sort of answer that sounded impressively cunning, which had better not actually get in the way of Professor Quirrell's teaching defense. And of course, Harry would go over to his dark side and think it through from that direction, just to be honest, and just in case. "Tell me," Harry said, "everything about how the Dementor is to be brought in and how it is to be guarded." Dumbledore's eyebrows rose for a moment, and then the old wizard began to speak. The Dementor would be transported to the grounds of Hogwarts by an Auror trio, all three personally known to the headmaster, and all three able to cast a corporeal patronus charm. They would be met at the edge of the grounds by Dumbledore, who would pass the Dementor through the Hogwarts wards. Harry asked if the pass was permanent or temporary, whether someone could just bring in the same Dementor again the next day. "The pass was temporary," replied the headmaster with an approving nod, and the explanation went on. The Dementor would be in a cage of solid titanium bars, not transfigured but true-forged. In time, a Dementor's presence would corrode that metal to dust, but not in a single day. Students awaiting their turn would stay well back of the Dementor, behind two corporeal patronuses maintained by two of the three auras at any given time. Dumbledore would wait by the Dementor's cage with his patronus. A single student would approach the Dementor, and Dumbledore would dispel his patronus, and the student would attempt to cast their own patronus charm, and if they failed, Dumbledore would restore his patronus before the student could suffer any permanent damage. Past dueling champion Professor Flitwick would also be present while there were students near, just to add safety margin. "Why just you waiting by the Dementor?" said Harry. "I mean, shouldn't it be you plus an aura?" The headmaster shook his head. "They could not withstand the repeated exposure to the Dementor each time I dispel my patronus. And if Dumbledore's patronus did fail for some reason, while one of the students was still near the Dementor, the third aura would cast another corporeal patronus and send it to shield the student." Harry poked and prodded, but he couldn't see a flaw in the security. So Harry took a deep breath, sank further into the chair, closed his eyes, and remembered. "And that will be 5 points. No, let us make it an even 10 points from Ravenclaw for backchat." The cold came more slowly now, more reluctantly. Harry hadn't been calling much on his dark side lately. Harry had to run through that entire session in potions in his mind before his blood chilled into something approaching deadly crystalline clarity. And then he thought of the Dementor, and it was obvious. "The Dementor is a distraction," Harry said, the coldness clear in his voice, since that was what Dumbledore wanted and expected. A large, salient threat, but in the end straightforward and easy to defend against. So while all your attention is focused on the Dementor, the real plot will be happening elsewhere. Dumbledore stared at Harry for a moment and then gave a slow nod. "Yes," said the headmaster, "and I do believe I know what it might be a distraction from if Professor Quirrell means ill." "Thank you, Harry." The headmaster was still staring at Harry, a strange look in those ancient eyes. "What?" said Harry with a tinge of annoyance, the cold still lingering in his blood. "I have another question for that young man," said the headmaster. It is something I have long wondered to myself, yet been unable to comprehend. Why? There was a tinge of pain in his voice. Why would anyone deliberately make himself a monster? Why do evil for the sake of evil? Why Voldemort? Whir, bzzzt, tick, ding, puff, splat. Harry stared at the headmaster in surprise. How would I know? Said Harry. Am I supposed to magically understand the Dark Lord because I'm the hero or something? Yes, said Dumbledore. My own great foe was Grindelwald, and him I understood very well indeed. Grindelwald was my dark mirror, the man I could so easily have been, had I given in to the temptation to believe that I was a good person, and therefore always in the right. For the greater good, that was his slogan, and he truly believed it himself, even as he tore at all Europe like a wounded animal. Him I defeated in the end, but then after him came Voldemort to destroy everything I had protected in Britain. The hurt was plain now in Dumbledore's voice, exposed upon his face. He committed acts worse by far than Grindelwald's worst, horror for the sake of horror. I sacrificed everything only to hold him back, and I still don't understand why. Why, Harry? Why did he do it? He was never my destined foe, but yours, so if you have any guesses at all, Harry, please tell me. Why? Harry stared down at his hands. The truth was that Harry hadn't read up on the Dark Lord yet, and right now he hadn't the tiniest clue. And somehow that didn't seem like an answer the headmaster wanted to hear. Too many dark rituals, maybe. In the beginning he thought he'd do just one, but it sacrificed part of his good side, and that made him less reluctant to perform other dark rituals. So he did more and more rituals in a positive feedback cycle until he ended up as a tremendously powerful monster. No. Now the headmaster's voice was agonized. I can't believe that, Harry. There has to be something more to it than just that. Why should there be? Thought Harry, but he didn't say it, because it was clear that the headmaster thought the universe was a story and had a plot, and that huge tragedies weren't allowed to happen except for equally huge, significant reasons. I'm sorry, headmaster. The Dark Lord doesn't seem like much of a dark mirror to me, not at all. There isn't anything I find even the tiniest bit tempting about nailing the skins of Yermy Wibble's family to a newsroom wall. Have you no wisdom to share? Said Dumbledore. There was pleading in the old wizard's voice, almost begging. Evil happens, thought Harry. It doesn't mean anything or teach us anything, except to not be evil. The Dark Lord was probably just a selfish bastard who didn't care who he hurt, or an idiot who made stupidly avoidable mistakes that snowballed. There is no destiny behind the ills of this world. If Hitler had been allowed into architecture school like he wanted, the whole history of Europe would have been different. If we lived in the sort of universe where horrible things were only allowed to happen for good reasons, they just wouldn't happen in the first place. And none of that, obviously, was what the headmaster wanted to hear. The old wizard was still looking at Harry from over a fiddly thing like a frozen puff of smoke, a painful desperation in those ancient, waiting eyes. Well, sounding wise wasn't difficult. It was a lot easier than being intelligent, actually, since you didn't have to say anything surprising or come up with any new insights. You just let your brain's pattern-matching software complete the cliché, using whatever deep wisdom you'd stored previously. Headmaster, Harry said solemnly, I would rather not define myself by my enemies. Somehow, even in the midst of all the whirring and ticking, there was a kind of silence that had come out a bit more deeply wise than Harry had intended. You may be very wise, Harry, the headmaster said slowly. I do wish that I could have been defined by my friends. The pain in his voice had grown deeper. Harry's mind searched hastily for something else deeply wise to say that would soften the unintended force of the blow, or perhaps, Harry said more softly, it is the foe that makes the Gryffindor, as it is the friend that makes the Hufflepuff, and the ambition that makes the Slytherin. I do know that it is always, in every generation, the puzzle that makes the scientist. It is a dreadful fate to which you condemn my house, Harry, said the headmaster. The pain was still in his voice. For now that you remark on it, I do think that I was very much made by my enemies. Harry stared at his own hands where they lay in his lap. Maybe he should just shut up while he was ahead. But you have answered my question, said Dumbledore more softly, as though to himself. I should have realized that would be a Slytherin's key, for his ambition, all for the sake of his ambition, and that I know, though not why. For a time Dumbledore stared off into nothingness, Then he straightened, and his eyes seemed to focus on Harry again. "And you, Harry," said the headmaster, "you name yourself a scientist." His voice was laced with surprise and mild disapproval. "You don't like science," said Harry a little wearily. He'd hoped Dumbledore would be fonder of Muggle things. "I suppose it is useful to those without wands," said Dumbledore, frowning. "But it seems a strange thing by which to define yourself. Is science as important as love, as kindness, as friendship? Is it science that makes you fond of Minerva McGonagall? Is it science that makes you care for Hermione Granger? Will it be science to which you turn when you try to kindle warmth in Draco Malfoy's heart? You know, the sad thing is, you probably think you just uttered some kind of incredibly wise knockdown argument. Now, how to phrase the rejoinder in such fashion that it also sounded incredibly wise? "You are not Ravenclaw," Harry said with calm dignity, "and so it might not have occurred to you that to respect the truth and seek it all the days of your life could also be an act of grace." The headmaster's eyebrows rose up, and then he sighed. "How did you become so wise so young?" The old wizard sounded sad as he said it. "Perhaps it will prove valuable to you." Only for impressing ancient wizards who are overly impressed with themselves, thought Harry. He was actually a bit disappointed by Dumbledore's credulity. It wasn't that Harry had lied, but Dumbledore seemed far too impressed with Harry's ability to phrase things so that they sounded profound, instead of putting them into plain English like Richard Feynman had done with his wisdom. "Love is more important than wisdom," said Harry, just to test the limits of Dumbledore's tolerance for blindingly obvious clichés completed by sheer pattern matching without any sort of detailed analysis. The headmaster nodded gravely and said, "Indeed." Harry stood up out of the chair and stretched his arms. "Well, I'd better go off and love something then that's bound to help me defeat the Dark Lord. And next time you ask me for advice, I'll just give you a hug. This day you have helped me much, Harry," said the headmaster. "And so there is one last thing I would ask that young man." "Great." "Tell me, Harry," said the headmaster, and now his voice sounded simply puzzled, though there was still a hint of pain in his eyes. "Why do dark wizards fear death so greatly?" Said Harry. "Sorry, I've got to back the dark wizards on that one." Whoosh, hiss, chime, glorp, pop, bubble. "What?" said Dumbledore. "Death is bad," said Harry, discarding wisdom for the sake of clear communication. "Very bad, extremely bad. Being scared of death is like being scared of a great big monster with poisonous fangs. It actually makes a great deal of sense and does not, in fact, indicate that you have a psychological problem." The headmaster was staring at him as though he'd just turned into a cat. "Okay," said Harry, "let me put it this way. Do you want to die? Because if so, there's this muggle thing called a suicide prevention hotline. When it is time," the old wizard said quietly. "Not before. I would never seek to hasten the day, nor seek to refuse it when it comes." Harry was frowning sternly. "That doesn't sound like you have a very strong will to live, headmaster." "Harry." The old wizard's voice was starting to sound a little helpless, and he had paced to a spot where his silver beard, unnoticed, had drifted into a crystalline glass goldfish bowl and was slowly taking on a greenish tinge that crept up the hairs. "I think I may have not made myself clear. Dark wizards are not eager to live. They fear death. They do not reach up toward the sun's light, but flee the coming of night into infinitely darker caverns of their own making, without moon or stars. It is not life they desire, but immortality, and they are so driven to grasp at it that they will sacrifice their very souls. Do you want to live forever, Harry?" "Yes, and so do you," said Harry. "I want to live one more day. Tomorrow I will still want to live one more day. Therefore I want to live forever, proof by induction on the positive integers. If you don't want to die, it means you want to live forever. If you don't want to live forever, it means you want to die. You've got to do one or the other. I'm not getting through here, am I?" The two cultures stared at each other across a vast gap of incommensurability. "I have lived 110 years," the old wizard said quietly, taking his beard out of the bowl and jiggling it to shake out the color. "I have seen and done a great many things, too many of which I wish I had never seen or done. And yet, I do not regret being alive, for watching my students grow is a joy that has not begun to wear on me. But I would not wish to live so long that it does. What would you do with eternity, Harry?" Harry took a deep breath. "Meet all the interesting people in the world, read all the good books, and then write something even better. Celebrate my first grandchild's 10th birthday party on the moon. Celebrate my first great-great-great-grandchild's 100th birthday party around the rings of Saturn. Learn the deepest and final rules of nature. Understand the nature of consciousness. Find out why anything exists in the first place. Visit other stars. Discover aliens. Create aliens. Rendezvous with everyone for a party on the other side of the Milky Way once we've explored the whole thing. Meet up with everyone else who was born on old Earth to watch the sun finally go out. And I used to worry about finding a way to escape this universe before it ran out of negentropy. But I'm a lot more hopeful now that I've discovered the so-called laws of physics are just optional guidelines. I did not understand much of that, said Dumbledore. But I must ask if these are things that you truly desire so desperately, or if you only imagine them so as to imagine not being tired as you run and run from death. Life is not a finite list of things that you check off before you're allowed to die, Harry said firmly. It's life. You just go on living it. If I'm not doing those things, it'll be because I've found something better. Dumbledore sighed. His fingers drummed on a clock. As they touched it, the numerals changed to an indecipherable script, and the hands briefly appeared in different positions. In the unlikely event that I am permitted to tarry until 150, said the old wizard, I do not think I would mind. But 200 years would be entirely too much of a good thing. Yes, well, Harry said, his voice a little dry as he thought of his mum and dad, and their allotted span if Harry didn't do something about it. I suspect, Headmaster, that if you came from a culture where people were accustomed to living 400 years, that dying at 200 would seem just as tragically premature as dying at, say, 80. Harry's voice went hard on that last word. Perhaps, the old wizard said peacefully. I would not wish to die before my friends, nor live on after they had all gone. The hardest time is when those you loved the most have gone on before you, and yet others still live, for whose sake you must stay. Dumbledore's eyes were fixed on Harry and growing sad. Do not mourn me too greatly, Harry, when my time comes. I will be with those I have long missed on our next great adventure. Oh, Harry said in sudden realization. You believe in an afterlife. I got the impression wizards didn't have religion. Toot, beep, thud. How can you not believe it? Said the headmaster, looking completely flabbergasted. Harry, you're a wizard. You've seen ghosts. Ghosts, Harry said, his voice flat. You mean those things like portraits, stored memories and behaviors with no awareness or life, accidentally impressed into the surrounding material by the burst of magic that accompanies the violent death of a wizard. I've heard that theory, said the headmaster, his voice growing sharp. Repeated by wizards who mistake cynicism for wisdom, who think that to look down upon others is to elevate themselves. It is one of the silliest ideas I have heard in 110 years. Yes, ghosts do not learn or grow, because this is not where they belong. Souls are meant to move on. There is no life remaining for them here. And if not ghosts, then what of the veil? What of the resurrection stone? All right, Harry said, trying to keep his voice calm. I'll hear out your evidence, because that's what a scientist does. But first, headmaster, let me tell you a little story. Harry's voice was trembling. You know, when I got here, when I got off the train from King's Cross, I don't mean yesterday, but back in September, when I got off the train then, headmaster, I'd never seen a ghost. I wasn't expecting ghosts. So when I saw them, headmaster, I did something really dumb. I jumped to conclusions. I thought there was an afterlife. I thought no one had ever really died. I thought that everyone the human species had ever lost was really fine after all. I thought that wizards could talk to people who'd passed on, that it just took the right spell to summon them, that wizards could do that. I thought I could meet my parents who died for me, and tell them that I'd heard about their sacrifice, and that I'd begun to call them my mother and father. Harry, whispered Dumbledore. Water glittered in the old wizard's eyes. He took a step closer across the office, and then, spat Harry, the fury coming fully into his voice, the cold rage at the universe for being like that, and at himself for being so stupid. I asked Hermione, and she said that they were just after-images, burned into the stone of the castle by the death of a wizard, like the silhouettes left on the walls of Hiroshima. And I should have known. I should have known without even having to ask. I shouldn't have believed it even for all of 30 seconds. Because if people had souls, there wouldn't be any such thing as brain damage. If your soul could go on speaking after your whole brain was gone, how could damage to the left cerebral hemisphere take away your ability to talk? And Professor McGonagall, when she told me about how my parents had died, she didn't act like they'd just gone away on a long trip to another country, like they'd emigrated to Australia back in the days of sailing ships, which is the way people would act if they actually knew that death was just going somewhere else, if they had hard evidence for an afterlife, instead of making stuff up to console themselves. It would change everything. It wouldn't matter that everyone had lost someone in the war. It would be a little sad, but not horrible. And I'd already seen that people in the wizarding world didn't act like that. So I should have known better. And that was when I knew that my parents were really dead and gone forever and ever, that there wasn't anything left of them, that I'd never get a chance to meet them. And the other children thought I was crying because I was scared of ghosts. The old wizard's face was horrified. He opened his mouth to speak. So tell me, headmaster. Tell me about the evidence. But don't you dare exaggerate a single tiny bit of it, because if you give me false hope again, and I find out later that you lied or stretched things just a little, I won't ever forgive you for it. What's the veil? Harry reached up and wiped at his cheeks, while the glass things of the office stopped vibrating from his last shriek. The veil, said the old wizard with only a slight tremble in his voice, is a great stone archway kept in the Department of Mysteries, a gateway to the land of the dead. And how does anyone know that? Said Harry. Don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you've seen. The physical manifestation of the barrier between worlds was a great stone archway, old and tall, and coming to a sharp point, with a tattered black veil like the surface of a pool of water, stretched between the stones, rippling always from the constant and one-way passage of the souls. If you stood by the veil, you could hear the voices of the dead calling, always calling in whispers barely on the wrong side of comprehension, growing louder and more numerous if you stayed and tried to hear, as they tried to communicate. And if you listened too long, you would go to meet them, and in the moment you touched the veil, you would be sucked through and never be heard from again. That doesn't even sound like an interesting fraud, Harry said, his voice calmer now that there was nothing there to make him hope or make him angry for having hopes dashed. Someone built a stone archway, made a little black rippling surface between it that vanished anything it touched, and enchanted it to whisper to people and hypnotize them. Harry, the headmaster said, starting to look rather worried. I can tell you the truth, but if you refuse to hear it, also not interesting. What's the resurrection stone? I would not tell you, the headmaster said slowly, save that I fear what this disbelief may do to you. So listen then, Harry, please listen. The resurrection stone was one of the 3 legendary Deathly Hallows, kin to Harry's cloak. The resurrection stone could call souls back from the dead, bring them back into the world of the living, though not as they were. Cadmus Peverell used the stone to call back his lost beloved from the dead, but her heart stayed with the dead, and not in the world of the living. And in time it drove him mad, and he killed himself to be truly with her once more. In all politeness, Harry raised his hand. Yes, the headmaster said reluctantly. The obvious test to see if the resurrection stone is really calling back the dead, or just projecting an image from the user's mind, is to ask a question whose answer you don't know, but the dead person would, and that can be definitely verified in this world. For example, call back. Then Harry paused, because this time he'd managed to think it through one step ahead of his tongue, fast enough to not say the first name and test that had sprung to mind. Your dead wife, and ask her where she left her lost earring, or something like that, Harry finished. Did anyone do any tests like that? The resurrection stone has been lost for centuries, Harry, the headmaster said quietly. Harry shrugged. Well, I'm a scientist, and I'm always willing to be convinced. If you really believe the resurrection stone calls back the dead, then you must believe a test like that will succeed, right? So do you know anything about where to find the resurrection stone? I got one Deathly Hallow already under highly mysterious circumstances, and well, we both know how the rhythm of the world works on that sort of thing. Dumbledore stared at Harry. Harry gazed equably back at the headmaster. The old wizard passed a hand across his forehead and muttered, "This is madness." Somehow, Harry managed to stop himself from laughing. And Dumbledore told Harry to draw forth the cloak of invisibility from his pouch. At the headmaster's direction, Harry stared at the inside and back of the hood until he saw it, faintly drawn against the silvery mesh in faded scarlet like dried blood, the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, a triangle with a circle drawn inside and a line dividing them both. "Thank you," Harry said politely. "I shall be sure to keep an eye out for a stone so marked. Do you have any other evidence?" Dumbledore appeared to be fighting a struggle within himself. "Harry," the old wizard said, his voice rising, "this is a dangerous road you are walking. I am not sure I do the right thing by saying this, but I must wrench you from this way. Harry, how could Voldemort have survived the death of his body if he did not have a soul?" And that was when Harry realized that there was exactly one person who'd originally told Professor McGonagall that the Dark Lord was still alive in the first place. And it was the crazy headmaster of their madhouse of a school who thought the world ran on cliches. "Good question," Harry said, after some internal debate about how to proceed. "Maybe he found some way of duplicating the power of the Resurrection Stone, only he loaded it in advance with a complete copy of his brain state. Or something like that." Harry was suddenly far from sure that he was trying to come up with an explanation for something that had actually happened. "Actually, can you just go ahead and tell me everything you know about how the Dark Lord survived and what it might take to kill him, if he even still exists as more than Quibbler headlines?" "You're not fooling me, Harry," said the old wizard. His face looked ancient now and lined by more than years. "I know why you are truly asking that question. No, I do not read your mind. I do not have to. Your hesitation gives you away. You seek the secret of the Dark Lord's immortality in order to use it for yourself. Wrong. I want the secret of the Dark Lord's immortality in order to use it for everyone." Tick, crackle, FZZZT. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore just stood there and stared at Harry with his mouth gaping open dumbly. Harry awarded himself a tally mark for Monday, since he'd managed to blow someone's mind completely before the day was over. "And in case it wasn't clear," said Harry, "by everyone I mean all muggles too, not just all wizards." "No," said the old wizard, shaking his head. His voice rose. "No, no, no, this is insanity." "BWA, ha ha," said Harry. The old wizard's face was tight with anger and worry. "Voldemort stole the book from which he gleaned his secret. It was not there when I went to look for it. But this much I know, and this much I will tell you. His immortality was born of a ritual terrible and dark, blacker than pitchest black. And it was Myrtle, poor sweet Myrtle, who died for it. His immortality took sacrifice. It took murder. Well, obviously, I'm not going to popularize a method of immortality that requires killing people. That would defeat the entire point." There was a startled pause. Slowly, the old wizard's face relaxed out of its anger, though the worry was still there. "You would use no ritual requiring human sacrifice." "I don't know what you take me for, headmaster," Harry said coldly, his own anger rising. "But let's not forget that I'm the one who wants people to live, the one who wants to save everyone. You're the one who thinks death is awesome and everyone ought to die." "I am at a loss, Harry," said the old wizard. His feet once more began trudging across his strange office. "I know not what to say." He picked up a crystal ball that seemed to hold a hand in flames, looked into it with a sad expression. "Only that I am greatly misunderstood by you. I don't want everyone to die, Harry. You just don't want anyone to be immortal," Harry said with considerable irony. Seemed that elementary logical tautologies like all X, die X equals not exist X, not die X, were beyond the reasoning abilities of the world's most powerful wizard. The old wizard nodded. "I am less afraid than I was, but still greatly worried for you, Harry," he said quietly. His hand, a little wizened by time, but still strong, placed the crystal ball firmly back into its stand. "For the fear of death is a bitter thing, an illness of the soul by which people are twisted and warped. Voldemort is not the only dark wizard to go down that bleak road, though I fear he has taken it further than any before him." "And you think you're not afraid of death?" Harry said, not even trying to mask the incredulity in his voice. The old wizard's face was peaceful. "I am not perfect, Harry, but I think I have accepted my death as part of myself." "Aha," Harry said. "See, there's this little thing called cognitive dissonance, or in plainer English, sour grapes. If people were hit on the heads with truncheons once a month, and no one could do anything about it, pretty soon there'd be all sorts of philosophers, pretending to be wise as you put it, who found all sorts of amazing benefits to being hit on the head with a truncheon once a month. Like, it makes you tougher, or it makes you happier on the days when you're not getting hit with a truncheon. But if you went up to someone who wasn't getting hit, and you asked them if they wanted to start, in exchange for those amazing benefits, they'd say no. And if you didn't have to die, if you came from somewhere that no one had ever even heard of death, and I suggested to you that it would be an amazing, wonderful, great idea for people to get wrinkled and old and eventually cease to exist, why, you'd have me hauled right off to a lunatic asylum. So why would anyone possibly think any thought so silly as that death is a good thing? Because you're afraid of it, because you don't really want to die, and that thought hurts so much inside you that you have to rationalize it away, do something to numb the pain, so you won't have to think about it. No, Harry, the old wizard said. His face was gentle. His hand trailed through a lighted pool of water that made small musical chimes as his fingers stirred it. Though I can understand how you must think so. Do you want to understand the dark wizard? Harry said, his voice now hard and grim. Then look within the part of yourself that flees not from death, but from the fear of death, that finds that fear so unbearable that it will embrace death as a friend and cousin up to it, try to become one with the night so that it can think itself master of the abyss. You have taken the most terrible of all evils and called it good. With only a slight twist, that same part of yourself would murder innocence and call it friendship. If you can call death better than life, then you can twist your moral compass to point anywhere, I think, said Dumbledore, shaking water droplets from his hand to the sound of tiny tinkling bells, that you understand dark wizards very well without yet being one yourself. It was said in perfect seriousness and without accusation. But your comprehension of me, I fear, is sorely lacking. The old wizard was smiling now, and there was a gentle laughter in his voice. Harry was trying not to go any colder than he already was. From somewhere there was pouring into his mind a blazing fury of resentment at Dumbledore's condescension and all the laughter that wise old fools had ever used in place of argument. Funny thing, I thought Draco Malfoy was going to be this impossible to talk to, and instead, in his childish innocence, he was 100 times stronger than you. A look of puzzlement crossed the old wizard's face. What do you mean? I mean, Harry said, his voice biting, that Draco actually took his own beliefs seriously and processed my words instead of throwing them out the window by smiling with gentle superiority. You're so old and wise, you can't even notice anything I'm saying. Not understand, notice. I have listened to you, Harry, said Dumbledore, looking more solemn now. But to listen is not always to agree. Disagreements aside, what is it that you think I do not comprehend? That if you really believed in an afterlife, you go down to St. Mungo's and kill Neville's parents, Alice and Frank Longbottom, so they could go on to their next great adventure instead of letting them linger here in their damaged state. Harry barely kept himself from saying it out loud. All right, Harry said coldly. I'll answer your original question then. You asked why dark wizards are afraid of death. Pretend, headmaster, that you really believed in souls. Pretend that anyone could verify the existence of souls at any time. Pretend that nobody cried at funerals because they knew their loved ones were still alive. Now can you imagine destroying a soul, ripping it to shreds so that nothing remains to go on its next great adventure? Can you imagine what a terrible thing that would be, the worst crime that had ever been committed in the history of the universe, which you would do anything to prevent from happening even once? Because that's what death really is, the annihilation of a soul. The old wizard was staring at him, a sad look in his eyes. I suppose I do understand now, he said quietly. Oh, said Harry. Understand what? Voldemort, said the old wizard. I understand him now at last. Because to believe that the world is truly like that, you must believe there is no justice in it, that it is woven of darkness at its core. I asked you why he became a monster, and you could give no reason. And if I could ask him, I suppose, his answer would be, why not? They stood there gazing into each other's eyes, the old wizard in his robes, and the young boy with the lightning bolt scar on his forehead. Tell me, Harry, said the old wizard, will you become a monster? No, said the boy, an iron certainty in his voice. Why not? Said the old wizard. The young boy stood very straight, his chin raised high and proud, and said, There is no justice in the laws of nature, headmaster, no term for fairness in the equations of motion. The universe is neither evil nor good, it simply does not care. The stars don't care, or the sun, or the sky. But they don't have to. We care. There is light in the world, and it is us. I wonder what will become of you, Harry, said the old wizard. His voice was soft, with a strange wonder and regret in it. It is enough to make me wish to live just to see it. The boy bowed to him with heavy irony and departed, and the oaken door slammed shut behind him with a thud. 40. Pretending to be wise, PT2. Harry, holding the teacup in the exactly correct way that Professor Quirrell had needed to demonstrate 3 times, took a small, careful sip. All the way across the long, wide table that was the centerpiece of Mary's room, Professor Quirrell took a sip from his own cup, making it look far more natural and elegant. The tea itself was something whose name Harry couldn't even pronounce, or at least, every time Harry had tried to repeat the Chinese words, Professor Quirrell had corrected him, until finally Harry had given up. Harry had maneuvered himself into getting a glimpse at the bill last time, and Professor Quirrell had let him get away with it. He'd felt an impulse to drink a cum-tea first. Even taking that into account, Harry had still been shocked out of his skin. And it still tasted to him like, well, tea. There was a quiet, nagging suspicion in Harry's mind that Professor Quirrell knew this, and was deliberately buying ridiculously expensive tea that Harry couldn't appreciate just to mess with him. Professor Quirrell himself might not like it all that much. Maybe nobody actually liked this tea, and the only point of it was to be ridiculously expensive and make the victim feel unappreciative. In fact, maybe it was really just ordinary tea, only you asked for it in a certain code, and they put a fake gigantic price on the bill. Professor Quirrell's expression was drawn and thoughtful. No, Professor Quirrell said, you should not have told the headmaster about your conversation with Lord Malfoy. Please try to think faster next time, Mr. Potter. I'm sorry, Professor Quirrell, Harry said meekly. I still don't see it. There were times when Harry felt very much like an impostor, pretending to be cunning in Professor Quirrell's presence. Lord Malfoy is Albus Dumbledore's opponent, said Professor Quirrell, at least for this present time. All Britain is their chessboard, all wizards their pieces. Consider, Lord Malfoy threatened to throw away everything, abandon his game, to take vengeance on you if Mr. Malfoy was hurt. In which case, Mr. Potter. It took more long seconds for Harry to get it, but it was clear that Professor Quirrell wasn't going to give any more hints, not that Harry wanted them. Then Harry's mind finally made the connection, and he frowned. Dumbledore kills Draco, makes it look like I did it, and Lucius sacrifices his game against Dumbledore to get at me. That doesn't seem like the headmaster's style, Professor Quirrell. Harry's mind flashed back to a similar warning from Draco, which had made Harry say the same thing. Professor Quirrell shrugged and sipped his tea. Harry sipped his own tea and sat in silence. The tablecloth spread over the table was in a very peaceful pattern, seeming at first like plain cloth. But if you stared at it long enough, or kept silent long enough, you started to see a faint tracery of flowers glimmering on it. The curtains of the room had changed their pattern to match, and seemed to shimmer as though in a silent breeze. Professor Quirrell was in a contemplative mood that Saturday, and so was Harry, and Mary's room, it seemed, had not neglected to notice this. Professor Quirrell, Harry said suddenly, is there an afterlife? Harry had chosen the question carefully. Not do you believe in an afterlife, but simply is there an afterlife? What people really believed didn't seem to them like beliefs at all. People didn't say, I strongly believe in the sky being blue. They just said, the sky is blue. Your true inner map of the world just felt to you like the way the world was. The defense professor raised his cup to his lips again before answering. His face was thoughtful. If there is, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell, then quite a few wizards have wasted a great deal of effort in their searches for immortality. That's not actually an answer, Harry observed. He'd learned by now to notice that sort of thing when talking to Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell set down his teacup with a small, high-pitched tacking sound on his saucer. Some of those wizards were reasonably intelligent, Mr. Potter, so you may take it that the existence of an afterlife is not obvious. I have looked into the matter myself. There have been many claims of the sort which hope and fear would be expected to produce. Among those reports whose veracity is not in doubt, there is nothing which could not be the result of mere wizardry. There are certain devices said to communicate with the dead. But these, I suspect, only project an image from the mind. The result seems indistinguishable from memory, because it is memory. The alleged spirits tell no secrets they knew in life, nor could have learned after death, which are not known to the wielder, which is why the resurrection stone is not the most valuable magical artifact in the world, said Harry. Precisely, said Professor Quirrell, though I wouldn't say no to a chance to try it. There was a dry, thin smile on his lips, and something colder, more distant in his eyes. You spoke to Dumbledore of that as well, I take it. Harry nodded. The curtains were taking on a faintly blue pattern, and a dim tracery of elaborate snowflakes now seemed to be becoming visible on the tablecloth. Professor Quirrell's voice sounded very calm. The headmaster can be very persuasive, Mr. Potter. I hope he has not persuaded you. Heck no, said Harry. Didn't fool me for a second. I should hope not, said Professor Quirrell, still in that very calm tone. I would be extremely put out to discover that the headmaster had convinced you to throw away your life on some fool plot by telling you that death is the next great adventure. I don't think the headmaster believed it himself, actually, Harry said. He sipped his own tea again. Asked me what I could possibly do with eternity, gave me the usual line about it being boring, and he didn't seem to see any conflict between that and his own claim to have an immortal soul. In fact, he gave me a whole long lecture about how awful it was to want immortality before he claimed to have an immortal soul. I can't quite visualize what must have been going on inside his head, but I don't think he actually had a mental model of himself continuing forever in the afterlife. The temperature of the room seemed to be dropping. You perceive, said a voice like ice from the other end of the table, that Dumbledore does not truly believe as he speaks. It is not that he has compromised his principles. It is that he never had them from the beginning. Are you becoming cynical yet, Mr. Potter? Harry had dropped his eyes to his teacup. A little, Harry said to his possibly ultra-high quality, perhaps ridiculously expensive Chinese tea. I'm certainly becoming a bit frustrated with whatever's going wrong in people's heads. Yes, said that icy voice. I find it frustrating as well. Is there any way to get people not to do that? Said Harry to his teacup. There is indeed a certain useful spell which solves the problem. Harry looked up hopefully at that and saw a cold, cold smile on the defense professor's face. Then Harry got it. I mean, besides Avada Kedavra. The defense professor laughed. Harry didn't. Anyway, Harry said hastily, I did think fast enough not to suggest the obvious idea about the resurrection stone in front of Dumbledore. Have you ever seen a stone with a line, inside a circle, inside a triangle? The deathly chill seemed to draw back, fold into itself, as the ordinary Professor Quirrell returned. Not that I can recall, Professor Quirrell said after a while, a thoughtful frown on his face. That is the resurrection stone. Harry set aside his teacup, then drew on his saucer the symbol he had seen on the inside of his cloak. And before Harry could take out his own wand to cast the hover charm, the saucer went floating obligingly across the table toward Professor Quirrell. Harry really wanted to learn that wandless stuff, but that, apparently, was far above his current curriculum. Professor Quirrell studied Harry's tea saucer for a moment, then shook his head, and a moment later, the saucer went floating back to Harry. Harry put his teacup back on the saucer, noting absently as he did so that the symbol he'd drawn had vanished. If you happen to see a stone with that symbol, said Harry, and it does talk to the afterlife, do let me know. I have a few questions for Merlin or anyone who was around in Atlantis. Quite, said Professor Quirrell. Then the defense professor lifted up his teacup again and tipped it back as though to finish the last of what was there. By the way, Mr. Potter, I fear we shall have to cut short today's visit to Diagon Alley. I was hoping it would, but never mind. Let it stand that there is something else I must do this afternoon. Harry nodded and finished his own tea, then rose from his seat at the same time as Professor Quirrell. One last question, Harry said, as Professor Quirrell's coat lifted itself off the coat rack and went floating toward the defense professor. Magic is loose in the world, and I no longer trust my guesses so much as I once did. So in your own best guess, and without any wishful thinking, do you believe there's an afterlife? If I did, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell as he shrugged on his coat, would I still be here?